This webinar today is being hosted by the Waterwise Community Center. Technically, we're called the Chino Basin Water Conservation District, and we are a very small public agency with a service area primarily serving the western edge of San Bernardino County, the communities of Montclair. We're near Claremont, but communities of Montclair, this came out wrong, Chino Hills, Ontario, Rancho Cucamonga, Fontana, and Upland. And we say that our mission is threefold. We are here to demonstrate, educate, and percolate, all focused on water conservation. So that's everything from large-scale stormwater capture and infiltration to replenish the local groundwater, no-cost education from everything from K through 12 programs to webinars like this and other programs, and demonstration. We are working very hard on getting our 2-acre demonstration garden back open to the public. And so you can check our website and look for that in the coming weeks. We work with all sorts of audiences and age groups, including community members and the professional sector. And if you want to stay up to date of what we have going on, I would encourage you, if you don't get it already, to please sign up for a monthly newsletter. You can sign up at cbwcd.org/newsletter. You won't get junk, just one email a month letting you know about all of our upcoming free workshops, program updates, and some other gardening and water conservation content. And with that, we are going to do just a couple of polls throughout this workshop, one at the beginning and one at the end. It's really important information for us, tells us more about who you are and what you are hoping to get out of coming to workshops with us. And so please go through and click the relevant answers to each of these questions. We'll give you just a couple of minutes and then we'll share those results. Most people are done. Thank you very much. We're just going to give maybe about 30 more seconds and then we will get going. Okay. So let's share those results. The first question is not that interesting, but it just helps us get a good count of how many people are with us today. Most of you have been with us before for different programs or workshops. Thanks for joining us again. For those of you who are first timers, we are very happy to have you. And definitely please sign up for the newsletter. We have all sorts of programs going throughout the year and a lot of workshops coming up that will be really great content to support what you're going to learn today. So most of you have a bit of experience with growing Waterwise or California native plants, and whether you have none at all, a little, some, or have been doing it for a while, we hope to have new information for you today to help you look at plants a little bit differently, or maybe come up with some great new things to try on your site. Most people joining us either from our local area in San Bernardino County or just across the county line in Los Angeles. Welcome, everybody. A few people from Riverside. Thanks for joining us. Okay, so let's get going. So who am I and why am I even talking to you about this? So again, my name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager at Waterwise Community Center, and I am a big plant nerd. I spend most of my free time either looking at gardens, hiking, working on my garden at home, and have been obsessed with urban horticulture, how we build and maintain landscapes in Southern California for most of the last 15 years. And so this presentation today is really going to cover what, after 15 years of experimenting both in residential and commercial and institutional sites with landscape design and horticulture, what my top recommendations are for home gardeners in our local area here. If any of you happen to be joining us from more coastal and less inland valley areas, all of these plants are going to work great for you as well. You just might be able to get away with watering them, some of them a little bit less, but these plants are all tried and true for our hot inland valley areas. And so I just wanted to start with a couple of nice pictures before we get into the actual content and plants. And I like starting with this picture for this workshop because it really shows to me what plant selection can be all about. This is a front yard in the Pasadena area, so very similar climate to lots of where we live, and very simple front yard, some native deer grass, some manzanita, a few non-native but very well adapted agaves. But working with well-adapted local plants doesn't mean you can't plant what you want. So this person, they're probably from the Northeast or something like that. They have a Japanese maple and a hydrangea because they like them, but just one of each of them require higher water and a more shady spot. And then most of the yard is just perfectly adapted to where we are in Southern California. Your look can be cleaner and simpler, or it can be a little bit more wild and complex. This is a almost all California native front yard, or it can embrace an even drier aesthetic. So this is a little bit more of a desert aesthetic, but instead of just all gravel and a couple of cacti, works with some beautiful flowering native and Mediterranean climate shrubs to kind of soften that look, bring a little bit more habitat, and have a sage to bring some nice smell into the garden. So you have plenty of options of the look and the style that you can go with. Or something like this, which is very different, but just as much at home in Southern California as the last photo. This is a couple of locally native coast live oak trees and more of a local meadow planting, a much softer feel. Doesn't need to be complicated, doesn't need to be high design. So this is front yard that I like on the wilder side. That looks like it was probably designed by the homeowner, experimenting with plants, not a lot of structure, it's kind of some mulch area where the bench can go and a bird bath, but quite lovely. Doesn't need to look like this. And I don't say this to make fun of anybody. A lot of people in the last number of years have put in landscapes that look like this, that have a lot of gravel and a scattering of plants here and there. And the only reason why I bring this up is because most people put in landscapes like this thinking they're doing the right thing. But in fact, landscapes like this with a low plant density and a lot of rock just soak in heat all day, can be harder for the plants to get established. There is a place for some gravel mulch, but it doesn't need to be wall-to-wall gravel, doesn't need to be low plant density. We have plenty of options to have this nice lush look and feel that a lot of people want while still using very low water plants. One of the big ideas is that evolving to low water landscapes is not a compromise at all. And in fact, we have so many great low water plants that most of the time you end up with more interesting options, and you can easily have a more beautiful yard than whatever you're replacing that took more resources. It's just fine to start small and gain confidence. If you're just getting into this, maybe try something out first. You don't necessarily need to rip out all the lawn on your property if that's where you're at right now. Think about how much lawn do you actually use? If you don't use any of your lawn and you're tired of it, then by all means, go ahead, take it all out. Maybe if you're doing the work yourself, do it in phases so it's maintainable for you. You don't get overwhelmed. But if you use a small area for a dog, playing catch with your kids or whatever, think about how much you use. And then maybe you can start to cut that down and put in more interesting plants that do a lot more for your landscape and look more interesting as you go. But you don't need to resort to something like this. Definitely, that's just going to soak in a lot more heat, reflect it back on the plants, and make your front yard a place that you don't want to spend any time in. So let's go over a basic outline of what we're going to cover today. We're going to start with an introduction to California native and waterwise plants. We're going to talk about different factors that plants have, different properties of plants, and a little bit of insight about how to think about plants for your garden. We'll talk a little bit about where to research details of plants. Then we'll cover a list of favorite plants for home gardens. It won't spend too much time saying it's this tall, this wide. That's all stuff you can look up, but mostly we'll really talk about what I think is exceptional about these plants and how I recommend using them in the home landscape. Talk about where to get these plants because you can't just go to Home Depot and find them all. And then we'll cover a grab bag of other little things, talking about bringing it together and next steps as you think about your home landscape. So to start, what's a waterwise plant? There's no formal definition, but essentially I think of it as plants that love life here, wherever you are. So if you read certain books about drought tolerant or low water plants, oftentimes there's going to be a lot of plants in those books that don't really make the cut when we come to hot inland Southern California, because a waterwise plant in Colorado or a waterwise plant in Northern California is sometimes different than what a waterwise plant is in inland Southern California. There's definitely some overlap, but there's definitely some plants that in areas that get less summer heat, more rainfall, might be waterwise there, but not here. So it's a plant that's really adapted to life here in whatever conditions we put them. Certain plants will be waterwise in the shade, but will still burn in the full sun in the summer. So what do they have in common? One thing is that they probably do more for us than the plants that they're replacing. I consider that in terms of aesthetic, in terms of color, and definitely if we're working with California natives, which is a large category of the waterwise plants we'll talk about. Not all the plants we'll talk about today, but the vast majority of them are native to some part of California. California native plants in general tend to provide valuable habitat for pollinators, birds, and butterflies. So in addition to being beautiful, in addition to saving resources, they really give back to the environment much more than the plants that they're most likely replacing in your landscape. And together, they make your yard an exciting place where something's always changing. The waterwise plants that we grow here do things in all different seasons, depending on the different plants. If you get a good mix of plants, you can easily have plants blooming every month of the year. Something's always coming in, something's always fading out, and they become very dynamic, much more exciting places than, say, if you just have a lawn and a few rose bushes. And so when we think about what are the plants that are adapted, what are these kinds of plants that love life here? One thing I want to clear up right at the beginning is that doesn't mean we're only talking about succulents and cactus. And if you love succulents and cactus and want a succulent and cactus garden, by all means, go ahead. But this area is not truly a desert. And I hear time and time again, even politicians who should know better saying, well, this area is a desert. We need to live like it. It's not true. Technically, scientifically, it's considered a, excuse me, it's a semi-arid Mediterranean climate. So what does that mean? Well, semi-arid means it's dry, but not quite as dry as a desert. We do have drier years and wetter years, but pretty reliably, we have some winter rainfall and some years a lot of winter rainfall. And Mediterranean climate is defined by cool, wet winters and hot, dry summers, which is different than a lot of true desert. True desert gets summer thunder showers. And even though they might get less total rainfall, the dynamics that that sets up are a little bit different. And essentially what that means is that we have a lot more options than true desert plants. We're going to look at some true desert plants today that are great plants for the home garden, but we also have California native plants from non-desert areas that grow well here. If we go up into our local foothills, it's definitely not a desert. There's some great options of both locally native plants, plants native to other parts of California, and also from the other Mediterranean climates of the world. So if you think about some of the other waterwise plants that people are familiar with, rosemary, lavender, if we look at, there's a few things like red hot poker, those are from other Mediterranean climates of the world. So rosemary, lavender are from the Mediterranean basin. Red hot poker, lion's tail, those are from South Africa. There's a Mediterranean section of Australia, and then a small part of Chile. And there's not too many horticultural plants that we have in the nursery industry that come from there, but definitely Australia, South Africa, and the Mediterranean. And these plants often share similar adaptations to why they are able to live here, even though they're not like cacti or succulents. Oftentimes, those will include, and it's not all of them, but they'll have maybe one or a couple of them, gray or silver leaves, glossy or leathery leaves, fuzzy leaves. These are all things that actually help the leaf release less water and be more adapted to the summer. And they also sometimes have what you might call a sleepy summer. So instead of like a traditional, what people think of the seasons where winter is the dormant time and some trees lose their leaves and go dormant, some of our plants they don't necessarily lose their leaves, but they'll go semi-dormant. They'll kind of just close up shop for the summer. And some of our native plants, if you don't water at all in the summer, well, if they're well established, they'll survive just fine, but they might not look that attractive in our gardens. And so most of the time with our native plants, we'll give a good deep watering just once a month, just to keep them out of really going dormant, to keep them looking good, even though they're not going to grow that much in the summer. And that's all that it takes. It doesn't need a lot of water because they're somewhat dormant to be adapted to that long, hot, dry season. And a lot of these adaptations, especially with the leaf color or the fuzz, give these plants a great look that's really fun to use in our home garden designs. So here's just one example. This is a picture of a portion of my front yard. And on the left, this is Fragrant pitcher sage, which has that fuzzy leaf. And if you look at it in the morning when it is backlit, especially if there's a little bit of mist in the air, or in the afternoon, those leaves or the fuzz on those leaves just really makes the plant glow. And it's even more impressive in person. It's really hard to photograph. And so I just wanted to look a little bit about what some of our local plant communities look like, because it's not desert. We have oak woodlands, we have chaparral, but that's still high plant density, a lot of greenery, even though there's barely any soil. We have traditionally, and this is in northern San Diego County, still have remnants of oak savanna, where we have trees spaced in between grasses and other flowering plants. And we also traditionally would have meadows or grasslands, where we have lots of grasses, seasonal wildflowers, and other things. So in this case, there's some cacti mixed in, because cacti don't only grow in desert. And then you can see the oak savanna kind of blending in the back. And so all of these, we might not set something up exactly like this in our front yards, but all of these give inspiration for the kinds of things and the kinds of plants we could consider. And when we look historically, for example, looking at native plants and their adaptations, the recent series of droughts that we have are not rare historically if we go way back before Europeans came to California. And so these plants have survived through quite a lot. And so with just a little bit of care, a little bit of extra water in our gardens, we can really keep things looking good and having really beautiful landscapes. This is a local picture of a shrub. This is Melasma, just basically growing out of rock. These plants are really well adapted and can be very tough, but very green as well. And there's hundreds of well-adapted, beautiful plants to choose from. We're gonna go through just a sliver of my favorites today. But that can be overwhelming for some people who are just getting into this. It used to be really simple. Lawn, maybe a couple of roses, a tree, maybe a few lavenders, and then there's some few different generic, green hedge plants, and that was it for most people. Uh, and now it's kind of the Wild West, where there's a lot of people that want to take out the lawn. They want to get going with something that takes less resources, takes a little bit less maintenance, and is going to look great. But you go to the nursery and it's just overwhelming. We have a lot more exciting choices now for great things to do in our yards, but it can be overwhelming. But it doesn't need to be that complicated. And so what we're going to talk about today are some of those favorites to really get you going. One big idea is keep it simple. What I feel like is, for the most part, unless you want it to be a real horticulture enthusiast, a real like gardening is your hobby, there used to be a pretty simple default. Lawn, maybe some roses, maybe some hedges, maybe a camellia plant on the north side of the house, a few different trees to choose from. That was the default, and that was seen as good. And so now we want things that will survive in the amount of water that we realize that we have to use in our landscapes. We want things to be attractive. We want things to be interesting. And so collectively, I feel like we're in search for what that new default palette of plants is going to be. And there's going to be a lot of different opinions on it, but I propose that easy to grow, low water California native plants should be the new default. They are very well adapted here. They're very tough. They do the most to give back environmentally. And as they do that, they bring things like butterflies and songbirds to our yard, not only helping support those wild populations that are still losing habitat, but also they're just delightful to have around. To be able to look out of your window and see butterflies and birds all the time is really nice. So why wouldn't we just start there? And then we're not only going to look at native plants today, there's lots of other great plants to mix in, but that's just kind of what I propose as the starting point. These plants that expect the least and give back the most. And also in terms of keeping it simple, remember that you don't need 172 different species of plants in your yard unless you want them all. Most people that I work with, most people that come to our workshops, a few people are garden enthusiasts, that's their hobby, but most people who come, they just want to have a nice landscape at home. They don't want it to be the number one thing that they think about, but they want it to be nice. They're willing to put in a bit of work, but simple is going to be the way to go. Average front yard, 10, maybe 12 different species of plants. One or two large ones, some mid-sized plants, and then some small stuff to help tie it all together. And so we're going to look at a bunch of different categories to help you choose what you want in each of those categories. So where to start? Well, there's lots of different ways to start. I consider our workshops to be a pretty good place to start. And what the process might be depends on where you're jumping in. But for most people, it starts with getting inspired, considering what you want, and then taking a step back and considering what you actually want to maintain or pay someone else to maintain. Think about your goals for your project, research and plan it out and build it, and then enjoy it. Learn from it. There's going to be tweaks to be made along the way. A garden is never truly done. Embrace that as one of the exciting things about it. And remember that we're here to help. Plants are the most exciting part of this for many people, but the right plants are only part of the formula for success. They are crucial, but you're going to want to combine what you learned today with our other resources and classes for best results, because a design for a landscape, something that's coherent, that's easy to maintain, is more than just choosing the right plants. And so we have classes on design. And then also for most of us, we're going to want some sort of irrigation system. And setting that up right has a lot to do with plant health, how all your plants grow, making sure that your irrigation system can deliver water where it needs to go, that you understand how to set it so that it's giving the right amount of water at the right time. And so we have lots of classes for that as well. If you combine design, good installation, choosing the right plants, and irrigation, that's the formula for success. And so with that, we're going to start talking about the plants themselves. One of the biggest concepts that you should leave here today with, other than just some plants that you're interested in, is the idea of putting the right plant into the right place. Absolutely critical. That's going to be the number one thing to help you be successful. And so here are the major factors. Does this plant want sun, part shade, or full shade? Some plants are flexible. Some plants need only one. Some plants, they need full sun or they're not going to look good. Some plants can deal with sun or partial shade. Some plants need full shade. So making sure that you understand both that and how the sun changes in your yard throughout the year. There's a great resource that I posted online as well that will be at the close to the top of the list of things you can download at that website, cbwcd.org/presentations. So at the end of the day, right after this presentation, there's going to be a California Native Landscape Design Guide, which is a little publication, it's a PDF you can download that our agency put out that will be a good, just very simple first step in thinking about design as you also think about what to do with the plants you learn about today. And there's a couple of things in there that we're not going to spend the time to explain because they're in there and they're easy to understand today. But one of them is some tips on how to understand how the sun or shade is going to change in different aspects of your yard, whether it's facing west or facing north throughout the year, which is important for thinking about the sun or shade requirements of your plants. And then another section in there has a little box talking about how to do a simple drainage test for your yard and what the results will mean. Because the next factor is soil type and drainage. The vast majority of, or I would say the majority, not necessarily the vast majority, the majority of Waterwise plants want well-drained soil. You'll see that term come up a lot, well-drained soil. And so what does that exactly mean? So that publication has a little box and shows you very simple how to dig a hole, fill it with water a couple of times, time it, and know if you have well-drained soil. If you have sandy or rocky or sandy loam soil, you're going to most likely have well-drained soil as long as it's not physically compacted by like someone parking a truck there for a long time or something like that. So in our local area, might say like Montclair, most of Chino, Ontario, Pomona, they have sandy or loamy soils, tend to be well drained. If you get a little bit north, looking at like Upland, Rancho Cucamonga, Claremont, those are rocky soils. Those tend to be very well drained. And then if you go a little bit south, Chino Hills and parts of Chino, as you're getting to Chino Hills, there tends to be a bit more clay there. And if you get into the heavier clayey soils, you don't always have great drainage. Not the end of the world. What you're going to want to do is just make sure that you're working with plants that are adapted to clay soils, and there are plenty of plants to choose from. It might actually make your job a little bit easier because there's just less plants to choose from. And we'll talk about resources for figuring out what those plants are in just a bit. Another thing that's important is irrigation frequency. How often do these plants want to be watered to be happy? As you group them together in your garden, you're going to want to make sure that your plants that want the same amount of water at the same frequency are grouped together. The technical term for that is called a hydrozone. So for example, native plants that are really only going to want water once a month. That's not all native plants, but a lot of them. They're really only going to want water about once a month, maybe once every 3 weeks in the summer, are going to need to be on a separate part of your irrigation system, or if you're watering by hand, watered differently than, for example, at the very other end, if you have like roses or fruit trees or something like that, that needs water a lot more frequently. And so grouping those plants together, and some of them are a little bit flexible. We'll talk about some of those flexible ones that can help transition between those zones that want it drier and want it wetter. But irrigation frequency is key towards grouping things effectively. Other things to think about are growth habit. Is the thing upright? Does it sprawl out? And then if you can find the information, and sometimes you can, growth rate, making sure you don't put crowd very fast growing plants too closely to slow growing plants because they might get overwhelmed. If you're planting some slow growing plants, there's some really nice ones worth the wait, but you might want to make sure that you give a little bit more space around them so they don't get overwhelmed. And after that, we can start thinking about the other aspects of plant design, which are going to include things like leaf color. We have all sorts of great colors in Southern California for our adapted plants, from almost white all the way through dark greens. And just the contrast of leaf color as plants are placed next to each other can have a big impact on the aesthetic aspects of the design. Leaf texture and shape, structure, form, and density of plants, especially as you get into shrubs. Some are more open, some are very dense, some will block what you see on the other side of it, some will leave it open. And then in some cases, bark texture and color as well, especially on trees. Visual design often relies on contrast. So light leaves next to dark leaves, slick leaves next to fuzzy leaves, layering, working from a perspective, whether it's looking out the window of your house into your yard, standing on your patio, layering, moving from close by having lower plants to mid-range having some medium-sized plants, combination of medium and lower plants, and then maybe taller plants in the background, creating layers where you see the different groupings of plants, builds a sense of depth. And then repetition. So not necessarily just one of this, one of that, one of this, one of that, one of this, one of that at random. If that's what you're going for, if that's part of your design, that's fine. But maybe a group of 3 of a small plant over here, and then that group of 3 repeats somewhere else in the garden and somewhere else in the garden. It starts to build a coherent look. That's one of the key aspects of doing kind of a professional style of plant design. And so with that, we will start getting into pretty pictures soon. But really, I want to cover all of these principles first, right off the bat, because these are going to be the things I want you to be thinking about as we start looking at individual plants. So we talked about leaf color, we talked about structure. So now as we're going to start looking at pictures of plants, you have these different categories to start kind of analyzing these plants that we're going to look at with them. And so I won't spend too much time on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, since most of you have been with us for a program before. A lot of you have probably seen this, but just want to show this very quickly. The Inland Valley Garden Planner is the website we have for doing your plant research for Inland Valley Gardens. There's a few other great websites out there. If you're really into California native plants, there's a website called Calscape. That's great. But this website has detailed profiles of a little over 350 well-adapted plants to this area. It's the vast majority of what you'll find in a local nursery, unless you're going to a place that's really a specialty nursery. And so there's all sorts of different functions in it. I'll just look at a couple today, one of which is helpful lists. In that helpful list, there's a list that's our favorite plants for inland gardens. This largely overlaps with what we're going to be talking about today. There's a few extras because didn't have time to talk about all of them. And then in each of these, you get a full profile with multiple pictures you can go through. Description, water needs, so you can understand how to group those plants, put them in those hydrozones. Here, the basics: height, width, flower season, exposure, sun, takes wind, all that sort of stuff. If they attract birds or hummingbirds or all sorts of those things. And then once you put them in, you need to know how to maintain it. So also a maintenance section. And so because every plant we're going to talk about today has a profile in this Inland Valley Garden Planner website, I'm not going to take the time to go over the exact height, width, flower season of every single plant. I'm just going to talk about what the exceptional parts of the plant are, what you might not get from looking at this, because you can easily then, if you're going to use it in your design, look up all that basic information here. And then there's also a search that you can get to from anywhere on the website on the upper right. So you can just type the plant name into the search and bring it up. You don't necessarily need to go through a list or anything like that. The real core of this website is the plant finder, where you can click multiple criteria. So low water, say California native, full sun. I'm looking for small things to go along a path maybe, so perennial. And then let's say that you have clay soil. So this is a relatively new function that we added down at the bottom, plants for clay soil. And so now you've gone from 350 plants to 9 plants, some of which are going to be bigger, some of which are going to be smaller. You can look at the colors, do some research, but it makes the whole process of choosing your plants a lot more manageable. We are always working on something new, so check back often. Currently, we are working on pulling together to launch, at least in its initial phase, in some part of July, a section of this website that will have landscape design templates. So it will be a whole system that you can use to get inspiration for not just choosing plants, but how to use those plants together in a design. And so we're really excited about that, doing a lot of work on it. We think it'll be really useful to people, and that will show up here when it's available. If you get our newsletter, we'll also be definitely announcing it there. You can create your own login, and that allows you to save lists and access some other functions that lets the Inland Valley Garden Planner remember how you have things set up. So with that, let's get back to the main presentation and we'll start getting into plants. Okay, so the rest of this class is going to focus on the plants themselves. Design is also really important, how to put those plants together. So here's some resources for design. A couple of weeks ago, we did a California native design workshop, similar format, 3-hour online workshop in the morning. We recorded that and it's available at our YouTube site, cbwcd.org/YouTube. So if you're going to really want to jump into design, if you're interested in California natives, a number of the principles as well really apply to any sort of Waterwise garden design. I encourage you at your leisure to check that out. We also have a different design related workshop coming up on June 6th, same format, Saturday morning online, which is the do-it-yourself landscape design workshop. The California Native Garden Design Workshop really focused on a lot about planting design. The do-it-yourself landscape design workshop is more about envisioning your use for your space, especially if you're thinking about a backyard where you're going to be having like a patio and where to put your pathways and where to put your grill and how to kind of start to build the structure of your landscape, less about choosing individual plants, but envisioning, maybe it should have a hedge over there and then it should open into maybe a meadowy area and then the patio's over there, that sort of stuff. That's going to be covered in that do-it-yourself landscape design workshop. I would encourage you to join us live, but we also will be recording that and posting it to YouTube later. We also have that Inland Valley Native Landscape Design Guide that I had mentioned. And then also there is a great resource that was funded and provided by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. It's a free download called Lawn Be Gone. And it's a great guide. Again, doesn't cover plants as much, but covers the design process and the construction process a little bit. So you can use your plant ideas from this, but has a great coverage for example, of if you want to draw your site out to scale and do your planting design that way, how to do that on graph paper, think about where you're going to capture water in your landscape, digging your dry stream beds, stuff like that, and then creating your planting design that way. So with that, I'm excited for us to get into the start part where we start talking about plants. Let's get into that. So this is going to be just one suggestion for what I think could be the new basic plant palette for Southern California, especially our hot inland areas. So we're going to go through different categories: trees, shrubs, perennials, look at little fussy areas like that north side of your house where it's shady most of the year and then it's full blasting sun in summer when the sun is really high, and things like that. And we'll just go through kind of plant by plant. I feel like there can be almost an infinite amount of different beautiful gardens, different styles, just by sticking to this basic plant palette. All of these plants are plants that can pretty reliably be found. You might need to go to a specialty nursery or two, and we're going to look at a nursery list towards the end of the presentation. But they're relatively common to find, and they're relatively easy to take care of, very reliable plants. And so we're going to start with the largest and kind of longest lived plants and then work into smaller sorts of things. And I am checking, it looks like we don't have any open question and answers, so I'm just going to keep going. We'll start with small trees. We're going to cover a few large trees, but a lot of people don't have room for a huge large tree on your property. If you do, plant one. It'll be a great investment. No better place to hang out in the summer outside than like underneath a native oak tree. But for a lot of people, we're looking at smaller trees. And one of my favorites, first one we're going to start with, is the desert willow. So I'm going to have listed the common name and the Latin name for each of these plants. I'll stick to the common names because Latin names are very intimidating to people. However, if you're actually going to buy plants, I would encourage you to at least write down the Latin name because common names are kind of slippery. Oftentimes, a plant will have multiple common names. And if you go and you just ask for one common name and the person at the nursery happens to mostly know it by a different common name, then you might not get the plant that you're looking for. Occasionally, actually, there are other plants that share the same common name. So when you stick with the scientific name or the Latin name, even if you're just writing it down and bring it to the nursery, you always know you get the right plant. So desert willow. This is a relatively small one. They will get a bit bigger than this, but usually not more than 20 feet wide. They can take pruning very well, so you can prune it up. They look great as a multi-branched tree, but it's up to you. So if you wanted to cut off a few of those lower limbs and get it to trim up more, be nicer kind of near a walkway or patio space, that's just fine. They're deciduous. They lose their leaves in the winter, come back in the summer. So sometimes a deciduous tree is nice to have near a patio space. So for example, I planted one of these on the south side of my south-facing patio in the backyard. It's concrete. It's really hot in the summer. And so this is going to grow in. It's kind of the southwest side. So it'll provide some shade to it in the summer, but then in the winter, it's going to lose its leaves and let the sun in. There's a few notes that I'm going to have here. When I was putting this presentation together, I looked back at the kind of what I published as the description, what I've kind of promised to put out there. And there was a few things that I just didn't want to recover them as its own list because they overlap. So a few things that I noted here are things that, for example, take full blasting sun. So with that, I mean, not just full sun, but I mean reflected heat from an asphalt driveway at the edge of a parking lot, like as bad as it gets. There's plants that like full sun, and then there's plants that can really take the punishment. And a lot of us, especially if we're tearing out a yard that was just a lawn and replanting, we're not going to have any shade in certain areas. There might be reflected heat from the street, maybe a stucco house where you're planting something on the west side of the house, soaks up all that heat all day and reflects it back in the afternoon. So the plants that can really take that punishment, they're going to have a bullet point that says full blasting sun. And then we really highly encourage people these days when they redo their yards to put in at least some small feature, something like a dry stream bed, a little infiltration basin, something that can capture some of the water that's either coming from the yard or off the roof, capture it and let it soak into the ground. And so that creates wet zones. And there's only a few plants that want to grow really down directly in that flooding zone. And we have some of those here. And we have a note that says that they keep flooding. And then because we don't get that much rain, most of our plants do pretty well as long as they're just outside of that zone. But some of them really excel. For example, for the desert willow, that's where it naturally grows in habitat. It grows in the desert in California, into Nevada. I've seen it on really hot areas like near Red Rocks outside of Las Vegas. It'll grow right off the road where it gets that little bit of extra water that washes maybe down into a ditch or something like that. These really love that and respond very well. They flower in the summer, and they basically get these clusters of flowers that look like little orchids. They are absolutely gorgeous. And there's different cultivars you can get with different flower colors. If you just get the species, it could be a range from almost white to pink to darker. And so you can get certain what are called cultivars, which are propagated from taking a cutting of a branch of one that's known to look like it, and it's rooted. And so you always get the exact same flower color. There's a really dark one called burgundy that I really like. And these flowers are loved by hummingbirds. And this is one of those sorts of plants where the hotter it gets in the summer, it doesn't respond by freaking out. It responds with more flowers. We have one of these at our demonstration garden at the Waterwise Community Center. It's on the parking lot side of our building, right at the edge of a asphalt parking lot. And a couple summers ago, when it turned like 118 degrees, this thing just flowered more. A lot of our other full sun native plants really didn't like it. This thing was just in its element. So another great patio tree, this is a picture from Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden in Claremont, and the patio space that they have is Desert Museum Palo Verde. This is starting to become a actually pretty common tree in commercial developments. It grows quickly, it's very low water, it's very tough, it flowers most of the summer. It's definitely one that if you're allergic to bees, you might stay away from. I don't worry about bees at all. Most of the time you ignore them, they ignore you. But this definitely is loved by bees. It's great for pollinator habitat. It's loved by both native and European honeybees. And it's really lovely. It has a green bark. It gets flowers a lot of the summer. It does, if you're having it in a patio space like this, it does drop a lot of flowers. So if you're the kind of person that would want to sweep up every flower every day, don't put it over a paved space. In some days when it's really in a lot of flower, it almost will dust a patio space with their gold drop flowers. I think that's lovely. And then another one, this is really a shrub that can be pruned up into a tree. And it's one of those things where I just don't have a great picture of it. I've seen it and just haven't had a camera with me, haven't gotten a good picture. And so it can be, the structure can be much more attractive than this. I'm in the process of growing one into a tree in the front yard of where I live, and we'll be taking pictures of that process of training it. But this is Toyon, our local California native shrub. If you're hiking or even driving along some of our local freeways that are along wilder areas, and you see a big shrub that gets big white flowers in the spring, and then in the late summer and especially fall and into early winter has these bright red clusters of berries, that's Toyon. And it's a great garden plant as well. It's large, and so it would be a shrub that goes all the way to the ground, but with a little bit of training and pruning, you can grow it out, especially into a nice, it's going to want to be a multi-trunk tree, but a nice tree can take that full blasting sun. It can also take a bit of water too. So if you have a transition zone that's from what's going to be a dry Waterwise garden to an area that gets a little bit more water, Toyon can do quite well. And it's also shade tolerant. This thing can grow in everything from full blasting sun to almost full shade. It's an incredible plant. It's an incredible wildlife plant. And so for some of these that are good wildlife plants, I might briefly mention them, and I have the date later on in the presentation. We're going to be doing a whole other 3-hour workshop about gardening for wildlife, mostly focusing on songbirds and butterflies and native pollinators. Essentially, it's how to set your yard up to have a lovely looking yard, but also have it function as a small little home nature sanctuary. And I'm really going to get into the relationships between some of these top plants and the insects or birds that live with them and they will bring to your yard. So I'm not going to spend too much time on those exact relationships here. But this is an incredible wildlife kind of supporting powerhouse. The flowers are loved by pollinators, and then these berries ripen later. And these berries ripen and are on the trees into winter. So the local small songbirds that need food year round, the berries and the seeds within them are great winter food for them when there's not as much else available. Here's a close-up picture of the flower bud. And this is a native plant for people who don't necessarily love the quote native plant look. It's evergreen. It has these thick but very green leaves. It has that kind of leathery, thick leaf adaptation to the heat, but just looks very, very good year-round. So here's the clusters of flowers, and then the berries that follow and bring the birds. This one is a little bit of a wilder one. This is for people who don't mind or actually embrace how things change over the year. This is Mexican elderberry, also called blue elderberry, but there's European elderberries called blue elderberry. So this is another one that you would want to probably write down the Latin name. This is another local native plant. It can take being very dry, definitely wants water at least once a month, but it's mostly found in the habitat in areas that, not right down in the water, but where the roots can get into a little bit of a moister microclimate. And it's an incredible wildlife plant and is very lovely in its own way. It can be kind of gangly, doesn't have the nicest structure, and will lose its leaves in the summer. but when it's on, it is on. So this is one that if I only had room for one small tree, probably wouldn't choose. But if I have room for a few or have an area where I want to have something that's going to have some structure, some size to it, but is not necessarily front and center, this is a great plant. So I have this growing in my yard, kind of on a side yard that's not super narrow. There's some room. I'm not going to let it get till its full size. It's going to do some pruning, but in a space that wasn't that otherwise usable, it's going to provide some shade to the house. And this is another one that is loved by pollinators in the spring, and then birds come around for the berries later on. And so here you can see this happens to be in flower and have the berries right now as well. If you've heard of elderflower tea, you can actually make tea from the flowers. You could theoretically make jam from the berries. It'd be a ton of work, but mostly it's for the wildlife. And it has these big leaves that do drop during part of the year as part of its summer adaptation because the leaves are thin. So this adapts by going dormant. With some more extra water, you can keep it looking greener much more of the year. And so with that, we will go to large tree recommendations. If you have room for one big large tree, something that's going to get 35, 40 feet wide over time, the one I would default to, unless you have a better idea, is the coast live oak. This is one of our local native oaks. Historically would be the most common one because it's the most adaptable. It can naturally grow in the widest range of situations and does very well. Oak trees are interesting in how they grow, especially the coast live oak. It is, I believe, at least in the Inland Valley kind of urban conditions, the fastest growing of our native oak trees. And if you put it into the ground and you plant it at a reasonable size, there's no reason to plant these in a big box size. Those always have impacted roots. They grow slower in the long run. 15-gallon would be the largest I would plant it. And if you plant a 1 gallon, a 5 gallon, a 15-gallon tree, in 5 years, they're all going to be the same size. The smaller ones are just going to be easier to plant. Sometimes you can't find them in a 1 gallon, but a 5 or a 15 would be okay. And the first couple of years, you'll look at a tree like an oak tree, and it won't seem like it's growing very much at all. But you'll turn around at year 10, and you'll be like, "Oh my gosh, it's a tree." They do get going, and we have trees that at our demonstration garden that you would think were 50, 60, 70 years old at least. And Dave, who works with us still, who's been there for I think 22 years now, he planted them. So, and they're big canopy shade trees, oak trees, most of the ones I'm talking about. And coast live oak is evergreen, beautiful, stately tree, has great shade underneath because it has that density, and is also a habitat powerhouse. Oak trees are a species that are considered what's called an ecological hub, meaning they support so many different species of insects and animals in our backyards. It's going to be largely songbirds, although squirrels as well. And then there's the relationships that come with everything that comes after that. That's why they're called a hub. And so have one of these in my backyard is the only tree that was in good enough shape to leave when I moved into the place that I'm at now. And we happen to have an area that we can really let it take over. And I mean, it's just a riot of songbirds, nesting birds. There's all sorts of little caterpillars that will live on the oak leaves. And usually it's never enough that it'll actually defoliate the tree. You won't notice them, but that's baby bird food right there. So it really does well. It can take full blasting sun, likes at least half day sun, but it can grow up in a little bit of part shade. Absolutely great tree. So this is an older one. If you have an oak tree on your property and you still have lawn underneath, I would recommend taking out that lawn. The number one killer of oak trees in the urban area is they really don't like water. They don't need, once they're established, water at all in the summer, but they really don't like water any more than once a month. And so if they're in a lawn that's getting watered all the time, that's just asking for problems. If you are taking out a lawn, it's going to need to transition. You don't want to just totally cut off the water all at once. And so, yeah, beautiful, beautiful structure. Is a maintenance commitment, but beautiful, beautiful structured tree. Very different, but also large tree is Catalina cherry. This is a cousin of our local native hollyleaf cherry. but it's the version that grows out on the Channel Islands, and it is much larger and grows much faster. It's a tall, narrow tree. So this is going to max out at 25, 30, maybe 35 feet tall, but it will only be 10 to 20 feet wide. Takes pruning well. You can use them to make like a big privacy hedge, and it's a kind of more columnar. So if you want something that's going to be tall, but you don't have the width for something like an oak tree, this is a great choice. It also is going to grow a lot faster, and they can take some moisture. So they're good in that wet to dry transition zone. They actually do produce a cherry. It's mostly pit. We could eat the cherries, being careful not to break our teeth on the pit, but they don't taste like that much. You need to wait till they're super ripe, but the wildlife, birds absolutely love them. And they're beautiful in their own right. And then this is, I believe, our first non-California native tree in the presentation. This is Marina strawberry tree. It's a hybrid of two other strawberry trees that come from Europe, but they're from the Mediterranean, so it's well adapted. But it does some things that there's just not a native tree that does the exact same thing. It takes pruning pretty well. Slowly over time, it will get to be about 30 to 35 feet tall and wide, but it takes a while to get there. Can be kept a bit smaller if you want it to. And has this beautiful red shaggy bark and these very ornamental fruits. We can eat the fruit, but they don't taste like much. It'd be more like a garnish or something like that. And then they have these bell-shaped flowers that come in winter. They're great winter nectar for butterflies or hummingbirds. They look very similar. If you're familiar with our native manzanitas, they look very similar to manzanita flowers. It's a cousin. They are not in the same genus, but they're in the same family. This is very closely related to our native madrone that grows in farther north, more northern California. So very tough plant. It's not very fast growing. We have some in our demonstration garden at work that have been in the ground for about 7 years. They're planted in larger boxes than they probably should have been. And they're maybe about 12 feet tall and 12 feet wide now. So they'll get there, but not the fastest, but very attractive. And so those are going to be the top trees. You really only need a few to choose from. There's definitely other trees that can work, but between the oaks, the strawberry tree, the more columnar cherry tree, and then the smaller, what are called sometimes patio trees, it's a good amount to choose from. All great choices for here. And so with that, we start to look at things that are a little bit smaller. So we're going to look at large shrubs. Large shrubs are going to be things that might get up to 20 feet tall. Some of them definitely stay smaller. So we're talking about the like 6 foot tall to 20 foot tall kind of range. Usually they're going to be used in the background of a landscape from whatever perspective that is. So that is often, from the house looking out towards the edge of the property. And then some of the smaller large shrubs are also maybe good like up against the house. So maybe on either side of a window, kind of framing that. Or if you have a large enough yard to have kind of some accents in the middle of planting areas, large pops. Some of these are going to repeat in multiple categories, not a lot of them, but Toyon, how I mentioned before, it's a shrub that can come up, be pruned up into a tree. Normally does want to be a shrub, and it's a great shrub for kind of the edge of a yard, or if you want it to really kind of fill in the whole side yard, maybe to provide some more privacy to the side yard. Western redbud is one of my favorites as well. This can also be sort of pruned up into a tree, but it really, you can sometimes find it in the nursery as a single trunk tree, but it really wants to be a multi-trunk. And so even if you prune it up to open the bottom underneath some, it still always maintains a bit of a shrub-like form. It's absolutely gorgeous. It is deciduous, so it does this every spring. You get this great pink bloom that has no leaves on the tree. Just kind of opens up. Great wildlife plant as well. The bumblebees, the native bumblebees really like this. And then the leaves start to come out. And so you can see then the leaves, when they come out, they're this kind of very glossy yellow-green. They're very thin. And it's amazing with how thin the leaves are, how drought tolerant it is. And so here's, as it starts to grow out a little bit more, these heart-shaped leaves that you can kind of barely see in many cases, especially earlier in the season. They have a red little outline around. This is a plant that's really enjoyed best close up. And then as those flowers fade, they develop these pods, which I think are ornamental in and of themselves, but they're great bird food as well. So they become bird feeders, essentially. And so that is Western Redbud. This is one that can go on to that like once a month kind of watering regime after it's established, but also will stay looking a little bit lusher if it gets just a little bit more water every once in a while. Kind of up to you.
Hey, Scott, we have a question about the redbud.
Yeah.
So the question is, it says, I have a Western redbud gifted from a friend's yard. How long does the tree take to fully flush out?
I would ask Christy if you can type back in, and then we'll get back to it the next time we do questions. What do you mean by fully flush out? I want to make sure I give you the right answer, but I'm not sure if you're talking about leaf or to get that big flower display or what. So why don't we return back to that when we get the update on the question. And from there, we will go to a much smaller shrub, but it can still be 3 to 5 feet tall, 4 to 6 feet wide. So medium size on the larger shrub. This one might have gone into like a medium shrub category if I did that, but I kind of just kept it between large shrub and small shrub to kind of keep it simple. Patchy plume is a true desert plant. I've seen it in the wild at Red Rocks outside of Las Vegas, oppressive summer heat. It is one for that full blasting sun, reflected heat, getting heat from the street, driveway, west side of a house, something like that. And, you know, it doesn't necessarily need that, just any full sun area. The leaves, it's kind of a dense shrub. The form isn't anything spectacular. The leaves themselves are small, but it is selected for the flowers. The flowers are small and white, but then as they fade, you get this very fluffy kind of seed. The fluff is kind of like the tail on the seed. It helps, I think, with wind distribution, but it's very beautiful. It's this pinkish, whitish, captures the light and holds on the plant for quite a long time. And so this is it close up, just absolutely lovely effect. And so aesthetically, this is really what it's being planted for. Slow grower, but a little bit larger than that over time. This is the largest one that I've ever seen in this picture, is Howard McMinn manzanita. Our native manzanitas are incredibly beautiful plants. They often have red, either smooth or shaggy bark. They have this thick, leathery green evergreen leaf. They have beautiful flowers. They get berries that the birds like that are usually red. But they can be tricky to grow, a lot of them. They're very sensitive to not too much water, but sometimes they need some. A lot of the species of manzanitas are not for kind of beginning gardeners. Howard McMinn manzanita is a hybrid that's probably the easiest one to grow. It is one that you should not be intimidated to try. It's a medium, not a very fast grower. This one's probably quite old, and it can take a little bit of pruning. So one of my coworkers has a row of them that he maintains as about a 4 foot high and 4 foot wide hedge. Easy to do. If you want to let it get tall and kind of prune it out at the bottom over time, you can. It's often seen as like a 4 to 6 foot kind of shrub that goes all the way to the ground, and then maybe is pruned up a little bit at the base to expose that beautiful bark as time goes on. You can see here's being maintained smaller, close up of those leaves, quite lovely. Just like the Arbutus marina, winter flowers, great for hummingbirds and butterflies. And then we will look at Baja Fairy Duster. This is another true desert native plant, full blasting sun, definite full sun. That's going to be 4 to 6 feet wide, 5 to 6 feet tall, can take some pruning. And again, this is another one that's mostly about the flowers. Has beautiful, these like starburst, almost like firework flowers that can be on the plant after it really gets going after a couple of years, almost year round in our climate. Definitely has the most flowers in the summer, but can have flowers a lot of the year and is absolutely adored by hummingbirds. So that's going to be why you really plant it. And so I'm looking at the clock. It is 10 o'clock now. Why don't we take our first brief break, just like a 5-minute break or so, and we will meet back at basically 10:10 at 10:15, and we will keep going through the plants from there. I will check questions immediately after the break. So if you have some questions, type them in, and we'll do that as we get going. Okay, let's get going again. Hope you had a chance to refill your coffee or take a quick stretch. And I see that we have a couple of questions, both of which deal with transplanting or transplanted trees. So we'll kind of cover them together. One is more information about the redbud, which was transplanted a few months ago. It's about 7 feet tall and has a few branches and a few leaves on it. So native plants, as a generalization, can be pretty tricky to transplant. So you're just going to have to stay attentive to it. Don't let it dry out. Give it a good, really deep watering at least once a week minimum through the summer and see what happens. In addition to just kind of a generalization, redbud is a legume, and that whole family of plants generally doesn't really like root disturbance. And so you might kind of have an uphill battle. I would say do the most that you can for it this summer. It will still be a number of years till it turns into that full grown, beautiful bush, but there's a decent chance that you might lose the plant during the heat of the summer. And if you do, I would recommend just starting over, if you can, purchasing just a 1 gallon redbud from a nursery. It probably cost you about $12. And I have a 1 gallon redbud in my yard that I'm looking at right now out my window that was planted from a 1 gallon just over a year ago. And it's a nice shaped bush. It's about maybe 8 feet tall, with most of the bushy part of that about 5 feet and about 5 feet wide. So it's well on its way. But sometimes when you transplant things, you definitely set them back, and it could very well grow slower than if you started with a smaller but fully intact root system plant. But it might do fine. So just kind of stay on it, do what you can for it. If you don't have mulch around the base of the root area, I would definitely put on at least 2 inches of like a wood chip mulch. That'll help cover the soil and keep it a little bit cooler, which might give it a better chance. And then the next question was, do toyon trees take transplanting very well? Had one that's doing great in its first year, but had to move, seems dead or dormant at this time. Toyon is evergreen. So if it has lost all of its leaves, chances are it is dead. And again, I would recommend same thing. Start over, wait till fall probably. Start over with a nice either 1 or a 5 gallon plant if you can. They don't take transplanting very well. If you're wondering if a plant is truly dead after transplanting, you can always lightly with a sharp knife, so like a pocket knife or maybe a kitchen knife or even your fingernail, lightly scrape the bark. Directly underneath the outer layer of the bark, there is a layer called the cambium of the tree or the plant. This is all plants, except grasses, all plants with kind of woody parts. And so there's that layer called the cambium. The cambium is in a living plant going to be green. It's where the nutrient transportation happens. So if you start scraping slowly, getting a little bit deeper, and you get that layer that's still green, you know it's still hanging in there. Now, if the toyon has been transplanted and it is so stressed that it's been defoliated for quite a while, still might consider planting a new one. Chances are that it's been set back enough that compared to planting a new one, even from a 1 gallon, over the next 5 years as it grows into full size, that the new kind of fully intact root system plant is probably going to grow faster. But if you scrape and you see some green, it's still alive. If you scrape and you just get down to dry, hard inner wood, then you're going to know it's dead for sure. And then we had another question related to transplanting from Sally earlier on. Can you transplant sage to another part of the yard? Again, they don't like transplanting that much. If it is very small, like if you planted a 1 gallon plant in the fall and it is just starting to grow out, I have been successful before very carefully digging as large of a root ball as I can around the sage. And that's like basically the root ball is as big as the above ground part. Very carefully moving that root ball by keeping the whole thing balanced on a shovel into an already prepared another hole. and then very gently planting it. I was not happy that I had to move it, but we didn't realize that the footing of a pergola I was going to be building was going to need to go there. I thought most likely I was going to lose the plant, but just decided to see what was going to happen, and it did in fact get going very well. If it's not very small, if it's grown that much, if it's been in the ground for a year, I probably wouldn't even bother trying personally. And so with that, let's get back into the plant list and get going again. So we ended with Baja Fairy Duster. And next on the list is Coyote Brush. This is one that is sort of a utility plant. This is one that most people would use as a background in a larger yard. It's one that most people wouldn't choose if they just have a few plants in a smaller yard that they need to put in. It's evergreen. It's kind of just an evergreen bush, but it is a wildlife powerhouse. The flowers are small. They're not that noticeable, but the seeds that come after the flowers are loved by birds, and the flowers themselves are really loved by tiny beneficial insects. Oftentimes, if you go to one that's in full flower, you just see little tiny things buzzing around, but those beneficial insects are voracious predators of the pest insects, things like aphids that can infest our gardens. So they're great to have around. And then they have a very dense internal branching structure. So small birds really also like using them for nesting in. Those are some of the reasons why this is in here. Hollyleaf cherry. So this is the little cousin of that Catalina Island cherry. Hollyleaf cherry is a local native plant. Sometimes you'll see it in full sun. Oftentimes you'll see it in areas in nature where it gets like partial or afternoon shade part of the day, not necessarily canopy over it, but just not the fullest, most blasting sun areas. Can work on the north side of a house. I have a couple of them that I'm using as part of a mixed hedge on the northeast side of my house that are just starting to grow in. And this is going to be, if you look up information about them, sometimes you'll see it can get 30 feet tall. Those are really, really, really old ones in the perfect condition, kind of in the wild, that might be 100 years old. In most of our yards, you're going to be seeing like 8-ish foot hedge. They are not super slow growers, but they're not super fast. So you can also kind of prune them to keep them whatever size you want. It's a dark, leathery leaf. And then in the spring, they get these big clusters of flowers that beneficial insects love, pollinators love, and then they get a similar cherry as well to the other picture I showed, which is loved by local songbirds. Another very flexible plant in terms of sun, can do everything from full sun to almost full shade, is California coffeeberry. And there are a bunch of different kinds or cultivars of coffeeberry. They're all the same species. Here's the Latin names here. There's two different, what's called the genuses, the first part, because it recently changed. And so you might see it listed either way at a nursery. So I want to include both of them. Those changes occur because some graduate student does a bunch of genetic research, and then some plant people argue about it for a while, and then eventually they decide who's right. So if you just get the species, you're going to be looking at an 8 to 10 foot hedge or a shrub, maybe a little bit dense shrub, maybe a little bit taller than it is wide. They take pruning very well, though, so you can kind of prune it into any shape you want. But then there's cultivars. So there's, for example, a dwarf one called Eve Case that's pretty easy to find. That's going to max out at about 4.5 feet tall and maybe about 6 feet wide. And there's some other different dwarf ones as well. There's one that's more like this upright shrub called Leatherleaf that has a little bit glossier, darker of a leaf. And it's not quite as big as the species as well. That's going to be like a 6 to 8 without pruning. But it can take pruning. You can prune out the base a little bit to expose the bark, or you can just kind of generally shape it. Makes a really nice hedge. Planted about 5 feet apart, will grow in pretty quickly, pretty densely. And it's just an almost very formal looking native plant. Evergreen, just really nice backdrop. It's a great backdrop for then things like maybe the native sages with the grayer leaves and maybe native grasses or things like that. Here's it close up. It gets a lighter new growth and then has a darker, as you can see, older leaf. So that's kind of a nice contrast. The flowers are small, beneficial insects like them, but they're not huge showy things, but it's nice. Sometimes if everything is all huge and showy, it can be a little bit too much. So this is just a nice layer to have, especially as a backdrop in the garden. Close up the leaf with the flower. This is one of my favorite kind of go-to, you almost might say utility plants. And then it does get berries as well. It's called coffee berry because the berries change from, trying to see if we have a picture on it next. We don't have a picture. The berries are small, round, maybe half an inch, and they go from green to red and then to an almost dark coffee color. We can't eat them. Would give humans an upset stomach, but birds really like them. And then definitely requires part shade, at least dappled shade. Could work well on the north side of the house as well. Another mid-sized shrub. This is going to be about 6 feet tall, maybe 6 to 8 feet wide, but as you can see here, can take some pruning. This is a very narrow spot to put it. I don't think I'd put it somewhere this narrow, but it looks lovely there. And it's Golden Abundance Oregon grape. That is a hybrid of a couple of other species. It's very vigorous. It has a little bit of a tooth, so it can be kind of scratchy, not like a cactus needle, but kind of like a holly, and has a glossy leaf and gets these big clusters of yellow flowers in the spring, followed up by dark blue berries that technically we can make jam out of them. They're just very tart. You have to add a lot of sweetener, there's a lot of seed, but again, the birds love them. And they're in big clusters on the plant, so they're quite ornamental. So here those are, and you can see a close-up of the leaf. It's quite nice. There's a dwarf cousin of it that works well in a lot of smaller places as well that has very similar nice attributes, and we'll look at that later. And so those are a smattering of those larger shrubs, which are often, again, going to be used for maybe hedge, privacy, background kind of things. Now we're going to look at what would be the middle layer. So if those shrubs in a typical use, from whatever perspective you'd be looking at it from, are going to be the background, in the middle, you'll often have medium and smaller sized shrubs, maybe with some perennials or ground covers in between. So here's just one example of a garden in the San Fernando Valley that has a whole series of those medium-sized shrubs on the left-hand side of this path. Some great choices. And this is a relatively narrow area. And so you can see this was pre-existing before the native garden went in. So green, large shrub, and then these middle ones, and then the path, and then some smaller, more perennial material on the right-hand side. And so here we have Cleveland sage, white sage, and there is a giant buckwheat over here. And so you can start to see the different color contrast that I was talking about in the leaves. And in many ways, people tend to think a lot about flowers, but leaf color is actually, I think, where I spend more time thinking about color. Flowers I consider just kind of like a bonus to the look of a garden because they're not there all year round. But when you get the nice contrast between the leaf colors, that's something that's happening 365 days a year. I can tell here, this is a relatively narrow area, so they've been doing some pruning to keep everything nicely in balance, but it looks great. They're doing a good job. And that kind of pruning, when you do it, still, it's not like mowing a lawn. You're maybe clipping a couple of things once a month or something like that. Or you can just put them in a bigger space and let them stretch out. So a few other pictures of that yard, just because I think it's really nice how things come together with the different sizes. An existing crepe myrtle tree. So again, it doesn't necessarily need to start with a blank slate. That tree was definitely there before, but it's a very tough tree. So once it's established, it can be very happy with that probably once a month water that this garden's getting. So looking at the native sages are some of my favorite mid-sized shrubs. This one is a Cleveland sage hybrid. And you don't need to remember that. You could just remember the names, but because it's a hybrid of two different plants, there are a number of very similar ones in the nursery trade. And so you might see plants that are called either Allen Chickering Sage, Pozo Blue Sage, or Worldly Blue Sage. For all intents and purposes, they are almost the exact same plant. And even people who know a ton about native plants, once you put them in a garden, if you don't have the label there anymore, they are almost impossible to figure out. They're both hybrids with the same parents, but they all have the same lovely features. This not white, but like a mid-gray-ish foliage. They smell amazing. And they have from spring to early summer beautiful clusters of purple flowers that are absolutely gorgeous. They make great cut flowers to bring into the house. They'll make the house smell great. And they are loved by hummingbirds. They will develop seeds, and oftentimes they're pruned back after the flowers dry out, but you can leave those flowers around just to become part of the mulch layer in your yard, and smaller songbirds will come and will eat the seeds. Really beautiful. One quick note about this: you will often see them listed as 3 to 4 feet wide or 4 to 5 feet wide in online resources. In inland Southern California, they will reliably get 6 to 7 feet wide. So just want to make sure that I mentioned that. I'm not sure why those numbers are published. Maybe if they don't get the heat, they don't get that big, but in our gardens, they will get that wide. This is one of the plants that I most commonly see, probably because of that, put in a space that's too small for it. It really, I mean, sometimes I've even seen them 8, maybe even almost 10 feet wide. So put them in an area. It'll be easy to keep to 6 feet wide with a little bit of pruning, but give it at least 6 feet. Absolutely great plant. This should probably be in almost every Waterwise garden, and it can take that full blasting sun.
Hey, Scott, really quick.
Yeah.
Regarding sages, we have a question about when to cut back.
Oh, sure.
Maybe like a quick little maintenance tutorial on sages.
Yeah, absolutely. So first thing I would say is for all those sorts of questions, I would encourage you, I'll answer this one now happily, but I encourage you to check the Inland Valley Garden Planner entries on all of those because we talk about those. And there's a number of things in this question, I'll get to each one, that we address, some of which are pruning, but some of which are situations that come up that with a little preventative maintenance, you can avoid having the issue altogether or make it easier to deal with. Sometimes once the pruning is out of control, it's a lot harder to kind of get it back into place. So with that, do you want to read the question, Brandon, and then I'll answer it?
Yeah, of course. So are you suggesting light pruning throughout the year, or is there a time we would aim to do a deep cutback on sage shrubs?
Okay, and yeah, so the example ones are falling with an open center about 8 feet wide. Really common issue that I see a lot. And to be quite honest, you know, I've had to deal with, I have one in my yard right now that kind of is falling a little bit with that open center that we are working on doing some corrective pruning on. So a couple of things. Normal pruning for sages would be, I always recommend that some flowers are left till the seeds develop, but for the most part, your pattern can be for maximum bloom would be the flowers are going to fade once the heat really starts getting on in the early summer. As soon as most of the flowers have faded, either just like right when it's done or ideally letting some seeds develop, you'll do a light cutback. So you're basically going to cut back take off the flower stalks and maybe a couple of sets of leaves. Not a real harsh cut into the plant itself. Just kind of a light trim to clean it up, depending on how many sages you have and the look you have. You know, if it's just one that's an accent plant, real front and center, I might do all that work with a hand pruner, make sure it looks really good when it's done. If I have a big yard and a whole bunch of sages, I am going to do that work with a manual hedge trimmer. So not like a gas powered or electric one, but like the big scissors. Make sure that's really sharp and you can kind of just shape the whole thing pretty quickly and then maybe just a little bit of touch up work. After that, it's going to start growing back. Sometimes if you do that in a timely manner, if you stay on it, that might actually help stimulate a second round of blooming later in the summer. And then as that fades or as you are going into fall, it's going to want to put on a fall period of growth. So going into the fall, that's when you would do your main pruning of it, where you would cut back any new flowers as well that have faded by then, and as well probably about a third or so of the length of the leafy part of each branch. So you're setting it back a little bit to make it a little bit more compact, to give it a little bit more of a branching structure, to keep it nice and dense. And that's all written out in the Inland Valley Garden Planner entry on that. And so those are going to be your main things. Now, if you don't want to do that much work, the annual fall cutback, that's going to be the main kind of important one, or at least just once a year, doing that cutback, cleaning off the old flowers, and then cutting just a little bit into the leafy material. A common situation, though, with the big native sages is to have them fall open and then have the open center. Good news is that over time, they will usually, as the branches fall down, more growth will usually come back up and grow back in. Not off of the big woody parts themselves, but from the smaller branches. But oftentimes that happens because there's too much growth with maybe a little too much water early on. One of the things I always do with my native sages is when it really starts putting on growth before the first year, even before it starts flowering, I'll normally cut it back about halfway. So maybe when each of the young branches are about a foot or so, I'll cut it back about halfway to induce a denser branching pattern over the whole plant. That really goes a long way towards preventing that structure that's really going to want to fall apart. If it seems like it's flowering too much in the first year and that maybe it's unstable and going to want to fall open, trim off some flowers. The first year for any plant, don't get too invested in the flowers. You're really trying to set up a good long-term form. And so with that, let's move on. I think that's as much time we can spend on that. But that's kind of brought up some good things relative to other plants, and that's just an example of the kind of maintenance information you'll get on the Inland Valley Garden Planner. When we can get back to doing in-person workshops at the Waterwise Community Center, every once in a while we'll do a seasonal maintenance workshop where we'll walk around together in the garden, and I'll actually demonstrate those pruning techniques in front of people. It's easier to see. We're also talking about, and hopefully we'll be creating a series of YouTube videos that deal more with that maintenance and kind of show that. So very similar to that care regime that I just said, you take care of this the exact same way, is white sage. So this has, I don't have them next to each other, but that has a more of an almost silvery, almost white, that's why it's called white sage, leaf color. So it still has a contrast with the other sages that we just saw. Great contrast with really dark things, and a very different flower structure. The flowers are taller and much more open. Great wildlife plant as well. Incredible smell. That's it close up, even without the flowers. Just a great foliage plant, and smells amazing. All the sages smell a little bit different. And the flowers, if they're backlit, they just catch the light in an incredible way. California buckwheat, next one. This is a very local native plant. The white sage is a local native as well. California buckwheat is one of the couple of plants I absolutely love, if you're local to us, the freeway exit from the 210 freeway at Baseline has been recolonized by wild plants. I wouldn't be surprised if some of it was seeded by Caltrans early on, and this is one of them. The irrigation there is capped off, and they dry out because they get no summer water late summer, but even early summer. All the planted and irrigated stuff along the freeway will look like junk, and these wild plants just love life there with all that heat. Definitely a full blasting sun one. Got great, beautiful flowers. A lot of the year they'll hold onto it. But one of the great things about all of the buckwheats is that they really flower. They're kind of, some of them are just starting now, but a lot of them are gonna wait. It's like midsummer and then into fall. So the sages will be done, and then the buckwheats will come in. So you'll extend your flower season by mixing some of these different kinds of native and water-wise plants. Beneficial insects love them. And then these flowers will fade and dry into a rust color. And there's tons of them. You don't spend the time cutting them off. And in fact, a lot of the aesthetic appeal of this plant is the contrast between the fresh light flowers and then the faded rusty ones. And you can even cut those and use them as dried flower arrangements. And then birds will like the seeds. So you can see it here starting to fade. And so just kind of tuning into those seasons and appreciating that, not just kind of being in that automatic mode where the flowers fade and cut it off. This is really part of the appeal. Also makes it a lot less work. You can cut them off if you want, but plant doesn't care. It also has a cousin called Santa Cruz Island Buckwheat, which does quite well for us here as well. This one stays, if anything, a little bit cleaner looking more of the year. And here are the close-up flowers. The flower clusters are a little bit larger as well. So they're both great plants. I grow both of them at home. Couple of different options. The Santa Cruz one is a little bit more exotic looking, you might say. And then I put this in with the medium shrubs, even though it's truly a perennial, just because it's a large perennial. This could be 4 or 5 feet tall, 3 feet wide, and just these big seasonal clusters of these gorgeous purple, almost into blue flowers, absolutely loved by pollinators and hummingbirds. The leafier part stays down towards the bottom, gets these big flower stalks, which after they fade, you kind of cut them back hard each year and get it ready for next year. Because of that, it's not really a plant to use in that front and center area, because when they're cut back, there's just not much to see. It's not unattractive, but it's just a little bit of green foliage. And so how I really like to use them is in between other plants, especially this is native deer grass. That's how I find myself often using it. This is a picture from my front yard where I'll leave just a little bit of extra space between the large grasses, and then the penstemon, the showy penstemon, can grow up in between them. You really see it on display when it's in bloom, but then when it's done for the season, it gets cut back and it almost just kind of disappears into the landscape until it's ready to bloom again. This is also a local native plant. You'll sometimes see this in vacant lots around Claremont area. Moving on to another true desert plant. This is desert mallow. And this is a great one for full blasting sun. This one has probably gotten a lot of pruning. It oftentimes is a little bit floppier, but great plant. Just keeps blooming through the summer. You might cut it back a couple of times to refreshen it up, and it'll go right back into bloom after a few weeks. And it has a very interesting orange flower color. So it's a lot of contrast. It has a kind of mid-tone grayish, greenish leaf. So you get some leaf contrast and then that beautiful, beautiful flower. This is a mallow family, same family as hibiscus. Butterflies really love the flowers. Great plant for punishing heat. And this is another plant from the same family, so kind of a distant cousin, but also has orange flowers, more in the yellow orange, and then a different sort of silvery fuzzy leaf. This is Indian mallow, another great full blasting sun plant. This one is a little bit larger of a shrub, definitely one more for the mid-ground, and this one is quite a bit fuzzier, and so it's really hard to photograph, but if you see it where the sun is behind it, it just glows. It's absolutely incredible. Long flowering season on this one as well. Now we're moving into something that's quite a bit of a contrast, used almost in the opposite way. This is the smaller cousin of that Golden Abundance Oregon grape that we looked at earlier. This is Creeping Oregon grape. This is going to be 2 to maybe 3, probably more 2.5 feet tall. 3 feet, maybe slowly, because it does creep, but it's easy to deal with if you don't want it to keep growing anymore. Easy to just pull out every once in a while some of the little creepers that are coming up. This is, nice low shrub. Great for part shade. Doesn't want full sun around here. It can kind of grow in full sun. It just doesn't look great, but part shade, afternoon shade, small foundation planting on the north side of a house. It's great. Can put a whole row of them in there. And it's usually green, but then when it gets cold in the winter, it flushes into that really attractive purpley color. You can see it going into the beginning of its blooms. A lot of the buds are not quite open yet. It becomes even more of a show of those yellow blooms. that then ripen into those deep blue berries for the birds. We're just kind of jumping around here with the favorite plants in each category. So now we're back to another full blasting sun, local native plant. This is the other plant along with the buckwheat that has colonized that slope I like on the side of the freeway embankment. This is Brittle Bush. This grows natively from our area all the way out to true desert. It's a very attractive, almost white-leafed shrub that gets these yellow daisy flowers all over it, blooms a lot of the warm season of the year. These blooms are adored by butterflies and can really take that full blasting sun. So, something for people who like that drier look, instead of just going with succulents, mix in some succulents, a desert willow tree or that desert museum palo verde tree, and then some of those orange flowering mallows and brittle bush, and there you go. Beautiful, beautiful, sophisticated looking desert garden. That's also going to feel nice to be in. It's not just going to be all gravel and a few cactus. And then back to sages. This one is not the most common sage of choice for the home garden. This is black sage. It has a lot of the same characteristics as the other sages that we looked at. This is a true local native, grows up in the mountains right around here, has more of a mid-tone, just traditional green leaf and a white flower. So it's a little bit less showy. But when you actually get into planting design, I find it to be a very useful plant. Does want to get wide around here because of that heat. Again, this one's going to be 6 feet wide pretty reliably, could even be 7 or 8, easy to keep smaller, but it's not going to be that 3 to 4 feet that you'll sometimes read in different resources. But it smells amazing. It's probably the best tasting. You can experiment with all the sages. They're different flavor profile than the traditional like European sage that you would do with your roasted potatoes or something like that. There's lots of cool information online of different things people have tried. This one's, for example, like really good with maybe some chocolate ice cream. It's the most usable flavor profile in most cases. But the reason why I find myself using this aesthetically in designs is because it has that smell, the same habitat value as the other sages, but there are so many beautiful native plants with that silvery or white leaf color that sometimes as I'm pulling together the plant palette for a design, I'm realizing that almost everything is that lighter color. And if you stick together too many things that are all of that lighter color, they kind of, without contrast, they kind of rob that aesthetic impact from each other. So sometimes coming up with 1 or 2 plants that are going to work well and be a similar size to mix into the mix that have that deeper true green flower color helps everything else pop that much more. And so that's often how I find myself using black sage. And then this one, a very popular plant, not a California native plant, but easy to find, easy to grow, is Mexican sage. Salvia leucantha has those long flowers. It's not native, but it is loved by a lot of the same native pollinators. And the reason why I include it for people who really want to maximize the bloom time of their flowers, this will keep blooming in most years later on into the season after the heat really comes on, after the spring blooms have faded from the native sages. I've walked through gardens where there's lots and lots of different sages. All the native sages are done for the season. This thing is still in full bloom. And so all the little beneficial insects and pollinators have moved on to this Mexican sage. This is one that does need a hard cut back almost all the way to the ground every year in the winter. It's less late winter because it can be frost sensitive after that happens. It's more like a giant perennial plant that needs its annual hard cut back to look good, rather than like the native sages that tend to be more like small shrubs, kind of woody, semi-woody, shrubby plants. And because of that pattern, it does often later in the season, even when it's still blooming, thin out and get a little bit leggy at the base. So it's one that I also tend to use almost like that showy penstemon, where I'll mix it in with other things. So when it's cut back or when it's a little bit sparse at the base, you don't really notice it as much. And so that covers our shrubs. A lot of really good options in that middle layer. These are going to be some of our, especially when they're in bloom, our fanciest, our most striking plants. really great options, lots of different flower colors. And so with that, we're going to start looking a little bit smaller. And so now we're going to look at mostly this category. We're going to have smaller perennial plants. A lot of these plants can be used in places other than just the edges. And by edges, I mean things like along pathways, walkways, edges of driveways. But the reason why I put together this as the edges category is because something that I often see as people start to work with these sorts of plants and get excited about different plants and put them in, is that some of the shrubbier plants, the mid-sized shrub plants in the category that we just talked about, those can sometimes get a little bit bigger than the literature says on them, especially if they're really happy in your garden, your soil conditions, especially in our inland heat. And so oftentimes I'll see those used near the edge of a path, near the edge of a driveway. And if those get a little bit bigger than you're anticipating, sometimes you end up almost having to like hedge them back. They're always either growing over into a space where people are trying to walk. They become higher maintenance. And so really what I like to encourage people who are just becoming familiar with the plants to do is to use these larger shrubs more in the middle ground, a little bit farther from the edges, and then right at the edges where you need to be driving or walking, to stick with these smaller perennial plants that are a little bit easier to anticipate their size, a little bit easier to do the cutback and maintenance on. And they can definitely be mixed into that middle ground along with the hedge or along with the shrubs for sure, because you don't want it to just all be super dense shrubs. But the edges is really kind of where you're going to be using the majority of them. So one of my go-tos is red buckwheat. We have a lot of this in our parking lot at the Waterwise Community Center. This is one that I have around the edges of my front yard, kind of near where the sidewalk hits the driveway, where the sidewalk hits my neighbor's driveway as well. And this is a little cousin from the Channel Islands of the California and Santa Cruz Island buckwheat. It's got a very nice looking leaf close up in and of itself, and then it gets these long flower stems and buds. So right now in the garden, in my garden, it has these long stems and buds, no flowers yet, but still already looks very ornamental. And then it opens up into these pink to red, beautiful flowers on these long clusters, almost looks alien looking. Here's another picture, different lighting conditions of what it looks like close up, adored by beneficial insects, makes really cool, very unique, interesting cut flowers. This is a cluster of them. Each individual plant is likely to get 2 to often in the inland heat, maybe 3 feet wide. This is Margarita Bop penstemon. It has a slightly different, a little bit bluer, but very like the showy penstemon, complex flower color that goes from those blues to purples. It blooms for quite a long season. This is one that can take a lot of sun, but it can also take afternoon shade, can also take a little bit more water. So this is one, as we get into some of these perennials, I also will mention some that if you have existing fruit trees, oftentimes people just have mulch underneath their fruit trees. They don't really know what to have kind of along with them in the areas that are also getting water at the same time. A few of these can take a little bit more water and really will thrive in that zone. So this is one that I've successfully mixed in with fruit trees in that same area as well. Part full sun, then it gets part shade part of the day from the tree. Looks beautiful. Hummingbirds and butterflies love it. Complex flower color. And it could actually kind of range in flower color depending on the conditions and the soil. There's a few of these in the smaller ones that I'm also going to mention work well for parkways, or that parking strip that if you have on the other side of the sidewalk, want to take out the turf. A lot of people, that turf gets a lot of sun, gets kind of beat up. And so a common thing to do would be to take out the turf there, maybe install a little walking path that's about 18 inches or 2 feet along the edge. So people getting out of the car can walk along it, the door can swing over it, and then maybe a few pathways that go over to the sidewalk. And then you can fill the rest of it with low waterwise plants that can take the sun. This plant does pretty well, as long as it does need a very reliable, the first year, good deep, once a week soak for the water to get it going. But after that is very well adapted to that situation. The crucial thing with those parkway plantings is that you don't want to let the plants get too tall. Anything over like 3 feet or so in height can become a hazard if somebody's backing out of a driveway and can't really see, someone riding a bike or something like that coming along. So you want to look at low options. So that's why we're starting to get into talking about that in this section where we're looking at lower things for the edges. Firecracker penstemon. I love this plant. So this is a cousin to those other penstemons. This is a true desert one, California, Nevada deserts. And this really takes the heat. Full blasting sun. If you don't think any of the small plants will make it, this is one that's worth a shot. I have one of these where my asphalt driveway meets the sidewalk, gets western afternoon hot sun reflecting all that heat, and this thing just responds with more blooms. Beautiful, beautiful plant. Blooms a lot of the summer. Here's another picture of it. And the native verbena, so very different effect. There is the Verbena lilacina, lilac verbena, California native verbena. It can be pretty variable, but there's a slightly smaller, slightly more compact one called Delamina. That's the one that you would often find at a nursery anyways. And that is just a little bit smaller. So it's still going to be oftentimes 4 feet wide, 2 to 3 feet tall, covered in flowers spring until well into summer, depending on the year. Sometimes if it gets a little bit cooler, then a little bit hotter, it'll keep going. #1 butterfly attracting plant for this area. It's absolutely loved. Have one of these where I can see it from my couch in the living room, and certain times of the year, just kind of watch butterflies come and go all day on it. We'll also work with the parkway. We'll also work kind of grouped near fruit trees. Close-up of the flower, quite lovely. There's another close-up. This is a picture of the one in my front yard. In terms of the smaller kind of plants, yarrow is one of my favorite, what you might call utility plants. It's useful in so many different situations. One caveat about yarrow, it does spread from the roots. So wherever you plant it, it will slowly creep into all the surrounding areas if it's happy. If it's planted near larger shrubs, tall grasses, trees, or things like that, that's not going to be an issue because it won't really cause problems for it. But if it's planted very close to other smaller perennials, you might every once in a while have to do like a little bit of management of trimming the yarrow back or digging a little bit out. But it's great because it does creep like that. It will kind of fill in open space and fill it with a beautiful plant with a beautiful flower. It is very flexible. It can be in full sun and live off of that kind of once a month water after it's established, but it will look a little floppy and a little dried out. It does better aesthetically in part shade or afternoon shade in that sort of situation. It is a native to many places. The species is native to most of the Western United States. It actually, even same species comes from parts of Europe. Where you see it in Southern California in the wild is often like in the dappled shade towards the edge of an oak tree canopy, and you'll see just a little bit of it kind of doing its thing. So we tend to use more of it in our gardens. I think I do have a picture coming up from my front yard. I'll tell you a little bit about how I'm using it there. But it's a great plant. With a little bit more water, maybe once a week to once every other week water, you can use this as basically the turf alternative for an entire parkway. Not a problem. Works great near and underneath fruit trees. The small orchard section of my backyard, we have a whole bunch of these growing because not only does it love those conditions, the part shade does well on that same amount of water, but the blooms bring lots of beneficial insects that will, in part of their life cycle, like the nectar from the flowers, and in part of their life cycle, will eat the pest insects like aphid and scale off of the fruit trees. It's also good for that wet to dry transition area because it can take water. It's perfectly happy with plenty of water, with regular water. So if you are going from a lawn to a drier waterwise area, this can be in that transition zone. And it can also take seasonal flooding. So it could grow really well right along with your dry stream beds in the area that gets some flooding every once in a while, infiltration basins, all that sort of stuff. So that's yarrow. You can see it number of different uses. You can see it here, kind of full sun off along the side of the path, kind of growing in with some native sunflower. This is it earlier this spring. So you can see it's not quite in bloom yet here. It's just really coming into bloom now around the bird bath in my front yard. And it can take a little bit of foot traffic. Now, if you step on the flower stalk, the flower stalk will be down. It'll probably eventually curve back up, but the foliage itself is not really woody. And so it can actually take some foot traffic. It can take mowing. Sometimes people mow it once a month and they have it as a lawn alternative. I like the kind of a little bit wilder of a look, but we put it near the bird bath so it can get some extra water. We fill the bird bath, and just knowing I don't have a big front yard. I want it to feel very grown in, lots of plant material, because I don't spend a lot of time out there. It's mostly something to look at. But I knew that I was going to need to be able to walk around and get in there and do my maintenance. And so I'm able to walk over the yarrow to get to different parts of the yard without doing a lot of damage to things. And then there's just a few footprints that after a few days kind of work themselves back out. Right now, I tend to be pretty tolerant of in the summer, letting it, I consider kind of look like the summer, letting the yarrow look a little bit more wilted during the heat of the day, recovers in the evening. But if I ever decide that I want to keep it a little bit more lush looking, I don't need to water this whole area. I can just get out there with a hose every once a week and just wet down the yarrow part a little bit more. And that's all you would need to do, kind of manage that water difference. For some reason, ladybugs really love yarrow. So if you like having ladybugs around, or they are also one of the beneficial insects that do eat aphids and other pest insects, yarrow is a good plant to attract them. Also, for the same reason that I use it so that I could walk on, it is also really great at an edge of driveway situation where you, depending on the driving skill of the person, the shape of the driveway, oftentimes edges of driveways just tend to get driven over periodically. And if you have a lawn, it's really not that big of an issue. The sprinkler might be an issue, but the lawn is not that big of an issue. But then if you replace it with a lot of these kinds of plants that we're talking about, just one tire rolling over it can cause permanent damage. The yarrow can actually take that pretty well. And so that was what's just called common yarrow, the white one. Killia millefolium is the Latin on that. That is our native one. But there's another yarrow worth mentioning. That's a moonshine yarrow. That is actually a European yarrow, but it's from the dry Mediterranean part of Europe, but it actually does a little bit better in terms of not looking wilty in full blasting sun in the summer in our area than our true native one does, which natively really often grows in a little bit of at least part day dappled shade. And so the moonshine yarrow has this bright yellow flower, also will kind of fade to brown. I treat all the yarrows very similar to the buckwheat, where if after the flowers get going, if you want to deadhead cut back each brown one, it can be a lot of work because there's a lot of flowers. I just let them go and then kind of clean them up all at once towards the end of the season. And it's the contrast between the dry and the fresh that's part of the look. And so this is a very hardworking, long bloomed, easy to maintain plant that's not native but works very well. Another not native one. Oh, I just saw a question come in for a plant ID in another one next to the bird bath, which I want to grab that question now because I will forget. That in person, that's actually a pink flower. That's Hummingbird Sage. That plant almost made it onto my list. I absolutely do love this plant. It is definitely one to check out. Only reason why it's not on the list is because I think it's maybe not the easiest one to propagate in the nurseries. I've sometimes gone a very long time where I haven't been able to source this plant. And I really want to focus on plants that you should probably be able to find at least some nursery or another if you're looking for them like in the early fall during the main planting season for these plants. Can be really great. This time of year, once the heat's on, if it's in full sun, can get a little bit more sparse. If you grow it, it's happy to grow in everything from significant shade to full sun. In shade, it can tend to have a little problem with powdery mildew on the leaves, but it's an absolutely great, super beautiful plant. That's Hummingbird Sage. That is a California native plant. So moving on, we have Sundrops. This is a not California native, but Southwest native plant, but desert native. full blasting sun from something that's really like a true ground cover. One plant will get 18 to maybe 24 inches wide. So oftentimes you'll plant them in groups. Loves full blasting sun, will work perfectly fine in kind of gravel mixed in with your succulent garden. Great in the parkway, has these big flowers. And these flowers are really loved by butterflies, but also some really cool looking evening moths. There's some really large, really beautiful moths that people often don't see. And this plant is one of them that will bring them out into the garden for their nectar. That's sundrops. It doesn't look great. I wouldn't do a huge area with this because it tends to get pretty sparse and needs to be cut back in the winter. But then when they are on in the summer, they are really on. So definitely want to mix in with other species, but is absolutely beautiful when it's in its element. And then moving on to another local native, California fuchsia. This is a great one for ground cover or edges. It can tend to spread in the garden, so keep an eye on it, but it's very easy to pull out if it starts to spread too much. It can spread a little bit from roots, and it can also spread from seed. If you don't want to, I let it spread from seed because when it comes up, I would say about half the time I'm happy to let one come up where it wants to. And then the other half of the time, they're very easy to pull out. If you don't want it to spread from seed, you could just normally after flowering for a while, you cut it back. And so you can just cut it back a little bit early before the seeds develop. So California fuchsia, one of the great reasons to use it in the garden is that this starts blooming very late summer into early fall when a lot of the spring and summer blooms are done, and it will carry sometimes most of the way through the fall. So it really extends that season of color. Those red tubular flowers are absolutely adored by hummingbirds, and it has that beautiful light foliage that contrasts with like the greener foliage from the California buckwheat behind it. Beautiful, beautiful plant. Most of them are pretty low, like no more than a foot tall. There is one cultivar called Catalina that will get 3 to 4 feet tall, which is also very beautiful, used a little bit differently. And then these do go dormant in the winter. So when they do finally stop blooming in the fall, they'll start to look a little rough, and you cut them like to an inch above the ground. So again, not something that I'll use for a huge wide area. I'll intermix it with other things so that when it's down, you don't really miss it too much. And then when it's on, it's on. Good for parkways. Definitely takes that full blasting sun. So here's an example. It can fit into relatively small spaces. And another full blasting sun choice. Don't consider it a California native. I think it might grow on the very, very, very eastern edge of California, right into Arizona. I think I've seen it on some lists for that area, but mostly is a Southwest desert plant. It's called red yucca. It's not distantly related to yucca. It's not a true yucca, but it is a great kind of semi-succulent, super tough. Doesn't have any thorns like yucca though, so you're not going to hurt yourself on it ever. And it gets these beautiful pink to red blooms. This is just getting going. It'll be more dense later in the season. And those blooms with just a little bit of water, maybe once a month, will keep going through most of the warm season of the year and are loved by hummingbirds. Definitely one if you like that drier, more deserty look to mix in. Great for full blasting sun, great for parkways. Can even grow in a pot as well. Kind of on the little bit more lush looking, but still low water side, we have, this is a Baja plant, Mexican daisy, also called Santa Barbara daisy. And it is a very lovely ground cover, gets to about 4 feet wide, stays less than a foot tall. Usually it'll grow and bloom and bloom and bloom, and it'll start to look a little bit not that great. Give it a cut back. Normally, I'll cut it back. You can get away with once a year. I'll cut it back twice a year to keep it really looking good. That stimulates it. It grows right back in. Full sun to partial shade. This is another one. I didn't list that it's good with the fruit trees here, but it's another one really great for around fruit trees and really great at attracting those beneficial insects that will help with the pest insects on your fruit trees. Here's the close-up. Oh, here we go. And also good in that wet to dry transition area, a little overspray from the lawn or something like that. It's pretty flexible on that watering. Now we're going to be looking at this ground cover, semi-grass. Technically, it's a sedge. Sedge is a grass-like plant. So if you're not wanting to get too technical, you can essentially consider it a grass. It's just a botanical difference. And it's a buncher. So you can see there's like one plant here, one plant here, one plant here. Normally planted, if you're going to keep it low like this is probably cut back a couple of times a season, maybe 2 feet apart. I like to let them get a bit bigger. So we'll plant them about 3 feet apart, and just a beautiful kind of calm green thing. You can grow them in full sun. I have some in full sun in my parents' front yard in Van Nuys, California, very similar to around here. They tend to get a little bit yellow looking, not that unattractive, but just a little bit more yellow looking in the summer. Need a little bit more regular water every couple of weeks instead of once a month. But if you get them into shade or part shade, which is really their element in hot inland Southern California, then you could probably be fine on a once every 3 weeks, once a month kind of water. And yeah, just beautiful, nice. Sometimes you just need nice, green, and calm. They are also one of the best plants for the wet to dry transition. So if you are going to have a patch of lawn, you can move from the lawn to maybe an area that's this to your really drier area. They're just fine near fruit trees, and they can actually tolerate full flooding. So if you have a dry stream bed and want to get some green kind of here and there amongst the rock, or you don't want rock at all and just want to vegetate it on the bottom, want a little bit of a meadow effect in a sunken area, these plants are a great choice. We're also going to look at a cousin of it a little bit later on. That's a great choice for that exact same situation as well. So this is a picture from my parents' backyard. So you can see the dominant plant here in the meadow. You can see it's a little bit bigger here. Here it's in bloom. It doesn't get a big colorful bloom, but it's attractive. This is that plant. And then we have things like Australian kangaroo paw, red hot poker, and some European tough bearded irises growing out. But that's the main plant to get that meadow-like effect. That it's one of the best plants to get that meadow effect. That is a true low water plant. On the more succulent side, but still looking at ground covers, things that are great for edges, great for full blasting sun and parkways as well. This is a very common plant. This is one that you usually can get at Home Depot. This is Bluefinger, Senecio mandrulaceae, great for just kind of slowly spreading and filling in all around. One plant will get 3 to 4 feet wide, but oftentimes they're planted a little bit denser because you can get them in like 4-inch pots or sometimes just a flat of them and cut them apart and plant them for some quick growing. So I really like this design. This is a front yard that I was just driving by in Pomona, pulled over, but let's look real quick at this design. Here's Toyon for our large shrub. Here's a hedge of that Allen Chickering native sage. So just some very simple elements, and there's some more of that native sage over here. And this was on the corner, I don't remember that street, if you know the area, Alvarado Street over here. So somewhat busy area, very small front yard. So to get just a little bit more privacy, one big hedge or one big shrub, very simple, well-chosen hedge that also makes everything smell great and provides habitat. And then in front, there's just a couple of other accents. Here's the Mexican sage, a few other little things, and then the ground cover. So accent shrub, hedge, ground cover, a few other accents. Here's a couple of aloes. There you go. Very attractive, very low maintenance, makes the yard smell good, makes the house more private. So that's what I'm talking about when it's, kind of keep it simple with the planting design. You can use these great exciting plants, but don't put too many things in if you want to keep it simple. Think really about what you want and go for it. Here is another Pasadena yard with so a little bit more designy, but again, using this as the area right along the driveway where there's some full sun, kind of right there as that foreground, easy to maintain. If it ever starts growing, just kind of clip it off. And so that's what we have for, I would say, our basic plant palette that we are going to talk about today in terms of those basic size categories: big, medium, small, smaller things for the edges. We're going to talk about a number of additional, what I call special conditions now. And again, there's many more plants than just these that you can mix in. You can have a great garden with just these plants, and then go from there and research some other things. But yeah, I think there's a lot to work with even just in that if you are new to planting. So with that, we're going to go into, why don't we see if there are any questions, and then we can go into those more special conditions.
Yeah, we have one question. Can you hear?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Says, is there a low profile nitrogen fixing native that works well as a companion plant for fruit trees?
Cool. I have a lot to say about that, but I am hoping that whoever asked that can stay till the end, because it's going to be, once we get into nitrogen fixing and natives, this is something that I had been wondering a number of years ago and did a bunch of research on. The answer is going to not be pertinent to everyone here. So happy to get way into that, but let's cover that towards the end. And I would say if you don't have time to stay towards the very end when we do, into the chat, why don't you give Brandon your email address and remind him that you're the person that asked the native nitrogen fixing question, and I can send you an email response. But hopefully you have time to stick around till the questions at the end. Okay. With that, let's get into talking about hedges. Sometimes a hedge, whether it's formal or informal, whether it's for privacy or just to separate areas of the garden, is just a really important thing to have. And in this Waterwise plant palette, we have some great hedge plants. Coyote brush, we talked about the main one, Baccharis pilularis, that's the big species earlier. That makes a great hedge. That's going to be more of like a 6 to 8 foot tall hedge. That is great to use in, I like talking about and I like creating what I'll sometimes call a habitat hedge at the edge of a property. A lot of times people have a fence, whether it's chain link and they don't want to see through it to the neighbor's yard, whether it's wood fencing or walls at the edge of the property. Could be a cinder block wall. Those are great areas to do long mixed rows of different native shrubs that will both be beautiful, bloom at different times of the year, and provide great habitat for food and also cover for birds to live and build nests and things like that. If you're interested in that technique more, definitely come to our upcoming class where we are going to talk more about gardening for wildlife. But most of these that we're going to look at right now are just good single species, traditional privacy or barrier hedge. So coyote brush has a kind of dwarf cousin called Centennial. It's a hybrid of different species. And this is a hedge of that they have at the nature gardens at the Los Angeles County Natural History Museum. That is quite lovely, gets a little bloom, attracts beneficial insects, and yeah, really simple, but I like it. The coffee berries, whether it's the full-size species that we talked about or the dwarf 4.5 foot tall or so Eve case, they all make great hedges. Full-size species one, I'm using that as a privacy hedge around part of my yard right now. Still has a lot of growing in to do. A full-size one, about 5 feet apart. The dwarf one, like Eve case or the similar ones, I might go 3.5 to 4 feet to make sure that I get that nice grow in. But yeah, very, very beautiful. Just a little bit of light hand pruning is all you need to do to keep them together. Great so this is the Eve case. Dwarf one used as a foundation hedge up against the base of a house. So you can use these plants with very traditional garden design if you want that kind of simple look. Foundation hedge, native plant, and this is, we're going to talk about turf alternatives. This is Western Meadow Sedge, kind of a little bit looser of a look, but basically lawn foundation hedge. But water-wise, great habitat providing plants. If you need a large hedge, and this will only apply to a few of you, that Catalina cherry that we talked about works quite well. I'm not going to be able to let mine get this wide, but we have a smaller row of 3 of these that we're using to basically cover up and not having to see the backside of our neighbor's garage, which is right near the edge of our backyard. Also for large hedges, Toyon works great as well. Not going to be quite as tall as the Catalina cherry, and actually our Catalina cherry hedge, as it tapers to somewhere where we don't need something to be quite as big, the next plant we have that'll kind of grow and mix in is in fact a toyon. Howard McMinn manzanita that we already looked at. I mentioned it can even be turned into a hedge. Here's an example of that. And then also small, relatively easy to find, and takes kind of formal hedging, can be more formal, or a lot of these plants, they have too large of a leaf to really take that traditional box shape. This is a Mediterranean native, water-wise and good smelling plant that you can create that very formal hedge effect with. And this plant has been used for hedging for hundreds, if not a couple of thousand years. Here's it as it's kind of growing into a hedge, a little bit looser. You can see it does get a small but nice white flower. Australian native, but one that does make a decent small hedge as well, and that hummingbirds love is Little John Bottlebrush. And then you can also get kind of creative with, sometimes you don't need something woody to be a hedge. So this is a line of one of my favorite native plants, and I believe it comes up later, but it might not in this presentation. So I'll just talk about it now. I should have put it in with the shrubs, even though it's not a shrub. I don't think I really have a space for the larger grasses in this presentation. This is deergrass, Muhlenbergia rigens. It's California native grass, and this will get to about 4 feet wide, maybe 2.5 to 3 feet tall, and then taller with the blooms up to maybe about 5 feet. And this is what the blooms do. They don't become this big showy flower, which is quite nice because then you don't need to cut them back when they're done. And so this plant gets kind of cut hard to the ground, maybe only about 6 inches tall. Every 3 years or so, as long as it's looking good, you can just let it go. And you can use it for all sorts of things. I like to use it as just a high contrast accent, very different than like the sages. So I'm looking out my window into my front yard right now, and I have that purple blooming Cleveland sage, and then kind of staggered around. And from my perspective on either side of it, there's one of these. And so you get that great contrast between the structure, the leaf, the color, everything. And it looks great together. But you can also use it very simply. Here it is in a row. Just needed something simple to fill in the small space. Next category is a tricky one. The north side of houses, garages, any sort of building, north side of a wall, anything like that. North sides are tricky, and we're talking about depends on the height, but on the average single story house, maybe the 5-6 feet up against the north side of it. Because the sun is high overhead in the summer, but then on either side of the longest day of the year, it's a little bit farther in the south. And then by the time we get to midwinter, it's pretty low in the south. The north side of a building is often throughout much of the year in the shade, even if farther away out of the shadow of the building, it's full sun. But then once you get to summer, it's full blasting overhead sun. And so that's horticulturally a kind of tricky area to find the plants for, because they need to be plants that are going to be happy being in the shade for most of the year. But then come summer, when it's really hot, they have that high blasting sun. And so here's kind of my favorite collection of plants that do well in that situation. California strawberry is one. This is one that, as you would normally use it in the garden, you really do need part shade or shade, and you don't want to put it in sun or it'll kind of burn and get crispy. California strawberry is California native strawberry. It is a true strawberry. They do get fruit, which are tiny. They're often very tart. They're sometimes delicious. The birds are going to get most of them. Consider it more wildlife, and you can snack on one every once in a while. But you can plant them. It's about 2 feet apart, and they spread and they fill in, and they look lovely. You can see it's going over the walk here. I think that actually looks quite nice. Every once in a while, you'll need to trim it back, but it just can also be grown underneath shrubs, and it will just kind of stitch in and fill the ground and make it harder for weeds to come up everywhere in between. Even though I normally would not use it in, like, if I was just planning out a garden, unless it was, significant shade. I've used this a number of times on the north side of buildings, and it seems like the overhead sun, as long as it is mixed in with a few other shrubs or things like that, doesn't bother it too much, as long as it's kind of filling in things together on the ground plane. I have this on the north side of my house in my front yard, and it works great. It can also take that wet to dryish transition. Really lovely. You can see, I don't think I ever really noticed it on this picture, that's also the strawberry over here. Toyon, I keep bringing up Toyon, but that's another one. In terms of a larger shrub, we've seen this picture already, but as a larger shrub, does great on the north side because it can take the shade and can take the full blasting sun. Native heuchera species. Heucheras are sometimes, they're also called coral bells. They're lovely plants. They're small perennials. They get beautiful flowers. This one is Heuchera maxima. And I think it might be called island coral bells for the common name for it. There's also a lot of cultivars and species that are more in the pinkish or bright reddish. I tend to really like the look of maxima, this one. You will sometimes see them listed when you look at information about plants as okay for full sun. That's going to be referring to Northern California, maybe Santa Monica, things like that. Inland Valley around here, they will fry in the summer if you put them in full sun. They might be able to recover, but they will look miserable. Shade here, they're great underneath an oak tree. As long as you move the oak leaf litter every once in a while, they can be great. I have a few in my front yard that do pretty well close to the house on the north side. When the sun is high overhead in the summer, they do yellow a little bit. They don't look great, but they look so good in the spring after they recover that I like to have them there. And there's enough other great stuff to look at when they're not in their element in the summer that I think that is just fine. Here's a close-up of the flowers. It's really complex as they go from the bud to the flower. Very interesting and complex color combination. This is a different cultivar called Wendy. It's more of a pinkish that works very well around these areas as long as it's in the shade. They do work very well underneath fruit trees as well. So this is one underneath the dense shade of a mulberry tree. California fescue, that's this accent grass on the right. It's a little bit taller. We'll talk about the plant on the left afterwards. California fescue, I almost didn't include because for some reason it's just not grown as much as it should in the nursery industry. So it sometimes can be hard to find. Specialty native nurseries like the Grow Native Nursery at the California Botanic Garden, formerly the Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, you can often, especially in the fall, main kind of planting season, you can find it. And it's just a great small accent grass. It gets a really nice flower and it has almost a blue texture to it. So I have a whole series of these. These can take sun or quite a bit of sun to almost full shade. And so they're really great as an accent grass on the north side. They can take flooding. It can take that wet to dry transition. So they're very flexible. Fragrant pitcher sage is another one. It's a very floppy thing, but that's the plant that I showed that picture in my front yard that was almost glowing when we were talking about the fuzziness at the beginning. Not one to write home about for structure, kind of flops all over the place, but it smells amazing. It has beautiful flowers and it looks lovely in its own way. And it can take quite a bit of sun. Even full sun, it looks just a little bit rough in full blasting sun in the middle of summer, but it rapidly recovers all the way to full shade, like underneath an oak tree. And so even though it doesn't have a nice structural form, that's what it looks like up close. And it's absolutely lovely. So those are some of my favorite north side plants. And then yarrow, I can't believe I missed that on the list, probably because it was already so many other places. Yarrow works great in that northern exposure. It can take that shade into the sun, as well as that Berkeley sedge that we looked at as well. That was that almost turf alternative, that bunch grass. That also does great in that northern exposure area. There might be a couple of other ones that we get to that I'll mention as well. So that's getting us through the north side. Another kind of special case is a sculptural accent. So we're going to look at a few things like succulents. Some people really like the look of either mostly having sculptural plants or sometimes just one or two really strong structural sculptural plants mixed in with things like our native shrubs and grasses can provide a different sort of look. So here is that deer grass can actually be a sculptural element in and of itself. This is a landscape that I designed where it's just kind of a meadow of deer grass underneath the tree, but you can see the structure of each one of those plants, especially if you're there in person. Here's just a single one in a more naturalistic landscape, but that pop of those flower colors can in fact provide that sculptural accent. And then another bunch grass that can provide that as well is the Texas cousin of our native deer grass, and that's pink mullygrass. That can also take that wet to dry transition that we talked about and gets this pink fuzzy haze of a flower. It's quite lovely. And then the succulents. I'm not going to go through a lot of species of succulents because they're going to fall into some major categories. But in terms of mixing in with other Waterwise gardens, you're often going to be looking at aloes. This is a very common one called coral aloe, but there are lots and lots of aloes available. We have profiles of a lot of them on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, but you can also just hit the nursery. As long as you get a decent amount of sun and well-drained soil, watered occasionally, you're going to be successful with most aloes. And then agaves as well. Most of the aloes, however, I'm not going to actually put in that full blasting sun category for Inland Valley gardens. Full blasting sun like Santa Monica version, no problem. Most of our aloes actually will perform full sun just fine. But that really hot heat, reflected concrete, all that sort of stuff, that's more the realm for agaves and some of them. This is one of my favorite agaves. This is the foxtail agave. That's the one that's really soft, no thorns. That one actually doesn't love that full blasting heat, but the more structural ones, the more solid one, like this one over here, there's a lot of different species in cultivars. Those can often take that more strong reflected heat. There's some profiles of some of our very favorites on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, everything from small, there's a great small hybrid called Blue Glow, up to larger and then very large ones. So sometimes if you have an otherwise shrubby, mostly native or southwestern garden, but a lot of that other kind of stuff that we've looked at, and then you include just a few things with these really sculptural rosette forms that can really make it pop. And then also, if you're really trying to go low water, you're letting things go almost dormant in the summer. Most of us are going to water more than that. But if you're into doing that, then sometimes putting in a few things like agaves that are going to be kind of in their sculptural element when other things might not be at their best also helps things look a lot better later into the season. So there's other succulents as well, but your main categories for getting that real sculptural pop are going to be the agaves and the aloes. And then a couple of vines. Vines will often take a little bit more water. That's just kind of their growth habitat, but they don't need that much. Our California grape is actually quite drought tolerant after it gets established. It can take as much water as you want to throw at it and will grow in response to the water. So it can take that wet to dry transition. It's shade tolerant. In Southern California, you'll see our California native grape growing mostly kind of creekside underneath tree canopy, but you can grow it in a horticultural situation in quite a bit more sun. This plant can be a thug. One vine is going to want to get like 40 feet long and huge. This is probably 3, one at each column, but one vine could cover this whole area. And you're going to be cutting out probably 70 to 85, almost 90% of it each year if you're growing it on a structure, so that it doesn't just completely overwhelm that structure. Vines are work, but they can be worth it. I've talked to some people that have these huge California grapevines over patios that run like a long part of their house. And after they tell me how much work it is, I say, do you regret planting it? They say, absolutely not. So can be up to you. But for a large vine, that's deciduous. So it's going to lose all of its leaves in the winter, so provide shade in the summer, but open up more in the winter. A California grape is great. It does get a lot of small grapes, which then, if they're not harvested, will fall. So you can have ants or other things like that. The grapes themselves are tasty. They're very small and they're kind of seedy. The birds love them. They're worth just kind of snacking on while you're out there. It's not like you're growing table grapes, but if you want to put the work in, it can be absolutely, absolutely lovely in the right place. You can, if you just want a little bit of it for the effect, you can grow it in a pot. The one in this garden was growing in a pot, and that will definitely dwarf it, keep it much smaller. Will still need its annual pruning. And there is a hybrid available that's a cross between a California native grape and a European wine grape. The leaves are the grapes are still quite small, but it gets this beautiful red fall color. This is at Tree of Life Nursery in San Juan Capistrano. We'll mention them when we go over sources in a little bit. And then a non-native but tough will need water probably about twice a month after established. Most of these things are once a week water at the beginning. Also very big, but evergreen is blood red trumpet vine, but it is lovely. I wanted to include at least one evergreen vine, and the hummingbirds absolutely love those flowers. And so it is 11:36. We're going to go through a few more plants and then some ending thoughts, talk about sources, and do more questions. So why don't we take our second 5-minute break now before we get into the real ground covers and turf replacement. So it's 11:36. We'll start back up at 11:41. And if there's any questions, feel free to type them in on the break, and we'll do a round of questions when we get back. Okay, we're going to be getting started back up in just a few minutes. I did not see any questions come in, so we will get right back to it. And we'll have time for then questions as we get to the end of the presentation in about 20 minutes. So we do have some good, more water-wise alternatives for some simple turf replacement that I think give us some more interesting options than just normal turf. Now, these turf replacement options are going to be probably higher water than once a month water, like some of the more shrubby landscapes, but far less water than traditional turf. So this is Western Meadow Sedge. So now we're not looking at this accent, which was the California fescue, but the Western Meadow Sedge here. And this can make a delightful little meadow. It can also be mowed about once a month and kept more like a traditional turf. It can take a bit of foot traffic. And all of these alternatives, we're not talking about like soccer practice, things like that. That's better for kind of more traditional turfs. But if it's like occasionally walking through, laying down in a blanket every once in a while, letting the dog have somewhere to just kind of tromp through, all of these will work. And so Carex praegracilis, Western Meadow Sedge, is a widespread California native, can grow in sun, usually really prefers and stays greener in a more dappled shade sort of area, and is also great as kind of something that can take that flooding, that wet to dry transition. It can take as much water as you want to put at it, but it doesn't need much. So in my backyard, I have a series of dry stream beds that all eventually lead to a final sunken area towards the bottom of the yard that we want to plant a small meadow in. And so it's planted to this. In the summer, we let it get just a little bit more yellow or golden in the summer, just its response as it dries out a little bit, but still perfectly healthy. It's still pretty green right now, and we give it a good deep soak about once every 2 weeks. So a lot less water than a normal turf, but then in a good rain event, that whole area will just totally flood and the plant's just fine with it. And then in the summer, it's rapidly growing in to be our nice little meadow. We have a red bud nearby that will eventually shade part of it, and it will be a great place to just put our feet in the grass and be in the shade. We have a little bit of yarrow mixed into it as well. And it's kind of growing into a great little naturalistic meadow where we will be able to sit in it or put our feet in it or walk through it like a small lawn, but very different, much more interesting looking, much lower care. Buffalo grass as well is another great alternative that can be left to be a little bit taller, or this one's probably mowed, I would guess, maybe every 4 to 6 weeks. And with this, we're talking about once a week water in the summer instead of 3 or 4 times a week. It's going to brown out some in the winter, similar to like St. Augustine grass. That's like a more traditional turf grass, but really tough, definitely quite a bit less water than a normal turf grass. Here's another example. Buffalo grass can be planted either from plugs or from seed. Here's one other example in a garden that I did. Here's one more example. This is one of the more popular kind of small turf alternatives. If it is really a full sun area, this is going to be a little bit tougher than the Western Meadow Sedge. And then yarrow itself can make a turf alternative lawn. If you really want to keep it looking good, you might be watering once a week, maybe once every other week. So you might want to put it on, like here, this large yarrow area is going to be on a different irrigation zone than the drier hedges around it. It'll survive on that once a month water, but for a swath this big, it's really going to want to be watered a little bit more to keep it looking good. And yarrow itself can also be continuously mowed to not even have the flowers, or just kind of a nice cut back and clean up after the flowering season. And those are going to be our my three favorite turf alternatives. There are definitely some other ones out there, but if I just had to choose a grab bag of my favorite ones, that's it. But sometimes people have a lot more ground to cover. If you happen to have a large property, or even more than that, sometimes I work with people who have large slopes, steep slopes. They don't want to get up there. They don't want to do a lot of maintenance. Then you might be looking at large scale ground covers. We talked about coyote brush. There is a dwarf cultivar of coyote brush called pigeon point coyote brush. It's quite tough. Once a month water to once every 3 weeks, keep it looking really good. And one plant itself will get 8 feet wide over maybe 3-year growing period. And it's just a low green, kind of nice looking plant. What often happens is that people will plant them too close together because they want them to grow in more quickly, and then they'll start mounding over each other, and then they'll start going over the path. So you're going to want to give them some space, maybe sprinkle some California poppies or something in between to keep things looking more interesting until then. But it will cover a large area and won't get any more than maybe 2 to 3 feet tall. So it's great if you want a large slope, but keeping something relatively low. I often will mix that in with this, which is Point Sal Spreader Sage. So it's a sage. This sage will get 8 to 10 feet wide, about 3 feet tall. So it's kind of a wider, lower one. It has a very light foliage color. It's a little hard to see in this picture. And so it's a nice contrast as well to be mixed in, kind of almost randomly dotted here or there, or a swath of the pigeon point coyote brush, and then a swath of the Point Sal Spreader Sage. Also very low maintenance. If you're looking at things that are lower, Mrs. Beard Sage is a sage that you can consider. This one, in its element, inland might want a little bit more water, definitely that once a month, maybe once every 3 weeks, depending on the soil. Will be about a foot tall, maybe a little bit taller with flowers, as long as it's not overcrowded and starts growing over each other. And again, will get 6 to 8 feet wide. But it's a little bit lower, a little bit less woody, a little bit more of a ground cover. We have a couple of big swaths of this in our park planting across the street or across the parking lot from our building at the Waterwise Community Center. Blooms a lot of the year. It can be, if you're really on a low water regime in the summer, this one can be, I guess you would say, a little bit dramatic. We're on a really hot day. It'll look just a little wilty during the heat of the day, even if the water situation is fine, but then it will recover. But it just blooms so much. It's like the first salvia to come into bloom in the spring, and sometimes one of the last to keep going. We had a question, what is the name of that sage again? The ones we've talked about are Point Sal Spreader for the bigger one, and Mrs. Beard for the smaller one. They're both quite wide, but the Point Sal Spreader is going to be a woodier, taller one. Mrs. Beard is a little bit more of a ground cover. And then if you have shade, and I mean no direct sun, no afternoon when the sun is low in the west, like hard angle going under the tree, but real true shade, Evergreen Currant, sometimes also called Catalina Perfume, is one of the top ground covers. It's beautiful, has a really glossy green leaf, doesn't have a ton of flowering, but it has a lovely, nice smelling flower when it does. This is, and it can take quite a bit of shade. This is going to be one of the #1 ground covers for like that hard to deal with, quite dense shade, root competition underneath established native oak tree. And then once a month water, once it's established, just fine. Won't be harming the oak with too much water. Really lovely plant. And one plant will get 6, 8, even more feet wide. Plant them about 5 feet apart, and it will grow in quite well. And so that gets us through our list of plants. And so in our last number of minutes, we're going to go over just a few other ideas and principles, and then we'll go back to questions. As you are thinking about your plants, it is important to avoid invasive plants. Invasive plants are plants that are so well adapted, but not native to an area, that they just spread all over the place and cause problems. I'm going to show you a few of our most common ones. In this area, the biggest problem invasive plant is this fountain grass. And sometimes it's still used in commercial landscapes. It's incredible that that even happens, because what happens is that it spreads all over the place, and they're planted because they're beautiful and they're very tough. This one comes from South Africa. A lot of the plants from South Africa are just fine here and are not a problem. But this grass has spread to our wild areas. It has taken over whole hillsides. It grows very fast. And because it grows so fast, it can sometimes dominate slopes and take away the habitat for some of our more slow but steady growing native plants. In addition to that, the invasive grasses are really a problem because in wild situations unirrigated, they'll dry out and they're a lot of fuel and easy to catch on fire in the summer in areas where our shrubs wouldn't catch quite as easily. So it's actually changed, this plant single-handedly in some areas has changed the fire ecology. And after things burn, the grass is there to rebound faster than the native plants because it grows so fast. So it can be quite an issue. So fountain grass is the biggest problem. Mexican feathergrass, which is a very common one as well, and it's also lovely, is not problematic to quite that degree, but is definitely considered an invasive plant and can be a pain in the butt when it spreads all over your yard. And then also an issue is pampas grass is one of the top ones. And this is really, really bad in some coastal areas, but it's still one that's problematic enough inland to avoid being planted. So there's other ones. If you're really interested in it, you can definitely do more research online. But definitely, if you take anything about invasive plants from this, is even though it's lovely, please do not plant that fountain grass. There's beautiful native alternatives and other non-invasive water-wise alternatives. Finding plants, main local sources, because you can't just go to Home Depot and find all of these plants. If you're looking for a specific plant, call ahead to the nursery, ask them if they have it available, because no nursery will have all the plants at any one point in time. Sometimes you need to do some shopping around, which should be fun. Some of them have online availability, so you can definitely check that too. For California native plants, if you are anywhere near where we are, California Botanic Garden, their Grow Native Nursery, formerly was Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden. They recently renamed themselves in Claremont. It's going to be your first stop. They do have an online availability. If they are not already, I think in June, they closed down for the summer because you don't want to be planting even water-wise plants in the summer. Ideally, you will plant in the fall when the weather is cool and getting cooler. Things will get rooted in, then come along next spring. Things are really ready to grow. You can plant through the winter and in early spring, but even like this time of year, it's already getting hot. Even in April, we can have a very hot May and plants won't do as well. Sometimes people go ahead and plant, but you're going to have better plant health, better growth, better survival rates if you plant fall through winter. Garrison Foothill Nursery in Upland has natives and water-wise plants as well. Armstrong Garden Center, most locally around here in Claremont, they're getting a little bit better with California natives, decent amount of water-wise plants. And then the rest of these are going to be a little bit farther out, but some great other nurseries. Lincoln Avenue Nursery in Pasadena has a lot of water-wise and even getting better selection of California native plants. Theodore Payne Foundation in Sun Valley is another that's similar to California Botanic Garden. It's another nonprofit just focused on native plants. They have a great California native only nursery. Tree of Life Nursery in San Juan Capistrano. If you're really into plants, worth the drive for it. It's a beautiful site, beautiful earth buildings that they've built there, beautiful demonstration plantings. For most people, they might feel like it's a lot to go there just for that. But if you're going to be out in that area, out in Orange County, definitely check it out. And you can call them for their availability. A lot of California natives, and then some other really interesting and eclectic water-wise plants. And then there's a few more small nurseries starting to pop up around Los Angeles that carry California natives and water-wise plants. A couple that I know of are Artemisia Nursery and Plant Material. If you happen to know of any other good nurseries to get native and water-wise plants, I'm always trying to add to my list. Please, please let us know in the chat. I would love to find out about more nurseries to add to the list. And then while you're going out to shop for plants, this is, as we're getting towards the last few minutes, it's almost going to be like a few plugs for other workshops we're going to be teaching later in the season. We have a lot of workshops that get around like a lot of the other topics to help you be successful, from design through choosing your plants, through installation and maintenance. I encourage you to think of this class today almost as like, to use an analogy, if you're a painter, these plants are the colors, but you need more than the different colors to make a painting. You need to pull it all together in the right way. So we have other workshops and resources to help you with that. Choosing young and healthy plants, you always want to check the roots. The biggest plant is not the best value for the size, because if the plant is really big on the top, it might have been sitting there for a long time And if the roots are like this, it's never going to grow well. The roots need to be able to grow out into the soil in their natural pattern. So even in the nursery, you can gently, carefully slide the roots out if you think that things might be root bound, and take a look. On the left, that's kind of perfect. On the right, that's kind of getting a little bit root bound. And if you join our classes where we talk about installation and establishment of plants, we will go through planting demonstrations, show you what to do. If you do have a plant like that, you can sometimes loosen them, but sometimes you just need to not get the plant, look for it somewhere else. Especially with trees, if you get root bound plants, that's going to be creating a hazard later on. Sometimes the trees will grow and then they'll just fall down when we have our Santa Ana winds. Caring for plants before planting. You're going to want to ideally have your site ready before you start buying your plants, not hold on to them for a long time in the pot. And after you bring them, if they're going to be there for just a little while in your yard, put them somewhere where they're part shade. If it's going to be a longer term, maybe some midday sun, but definitely some afternoon shade, and just keep them watered. It's going to depend on the weather. In the hot weather, you're going to have to water them once a day. If they're in full sun and really hot weather, probably twice a day, but don't let them dry out. You want your plants to be happy and healthy when they're going in. Conversely though, make sure you're not overwatering them, that they're not waterlogged all the time. So it's easier to just buy them when they're healthy, bring them in quickly and plant them. This, you're not going to be able to copy this down, but I'll give you a second to either do a screenshot, or you can refer to at cbwcd.org/presentations. You can download the slide. Just wanted to have, since we're not going to cover planting, a couple of planting demonstrations. The first one is one small one that we put together. The second one is a whole series from Tree of Life Nursery. So right after planting, these were planted from 5-gallon pots. I normally plant almost all from 1-gallon pots. This is actually a pretty high planting density front yard. These are heucheras, it's kind of small plants. You see a little bit more space around our accent shrub right here. It's going to look mostly like mulch, but then things are going to get going. So don't worry if it looks mostly like mulch. If it looks like it's already grown in, then it's going to be too dense. So here's an example from when we redid my parents' front yard in Van Nuys. Here's the landscape to be in the back of my truck. We had already done killing our turf, getting the site prepped, laying out plants, getting things in. And again, hardly anything to be seen. As you can see, did I get the date on this? Yeah, so this is April. October, this is just a bad cell phone picture starting to grow in. So this is from April to February, so a little less than a year. The next year, now all of a sudden, things are, remember that planting density? That's that same yard. Things are on their way. Pomegranate tree, our carex, our California fuchsia, our Moonshine Yarrow. So all of these plants that we talked about, other than the fruit tree, the pomegranate, our deer grass, sundrops. This is that California fuchsia, that Catalina one. So my partner standing next to it for size, September of that same year. You can see the yarrow on the parkway, almost fully grown in. It's already been cut back once. So things really do get going. This is a different native buckwheat, one that we didn't talk about, different accent. So when you do your research, look up the plant sizes, realize things are going to get that big. Don't crowd things in because they look too like it's not going to grow in when things are really small. They will get going. So next winter. So just one example. And what we went with is kind of flowery meadow. So some grasses, the carex, fuchsias, and then some citrus and pomegranate trees. Citrus on a different drip irrigation zone so that local area can get a little bit more water. And so in terms of the establishment, we're going to start plugging a bunch of other workshops. You can either join us live like this, or we'll be posting them to YouTube afterwards. We're going to be doing an installation and establishment of California native landscapes on October 17th, because that first year, we're teaching a lot of these in the fall, kind of just before planting season. So your ideal planting season is going to be kind of in November, starting then. So talking about this just before. how to install and establish these sorts of landscapes. Even if you're not doing California natives, that's all going to apply to Waterwise plants as well. Many native plants don't want a lot of that traditional care, but little water, no fertilizer, no compost, water deeply and infrequently. Maintenance, rather than thinking about maintenance, think more about care. You know, our gardens are things that we can care for, and then they're going to care for us right back, surrounding us with beauty, good smells, maybe a little to eat. Native Waterwise plants are mostly easy to grow, require a bit of learning and a little bit of a different approach. And plants are only part of the garden. So one of the next workshops that we have coming up is that gardening for birds, butterflies, and pollinators and more on June 27th, where we'll go over how to have wildlife habitat, things like lizards, birds, how to use these, you can say, colors of the garden to set up kind of your full painting and integrate other features to also invite the wildlife in. You can also have low water plants and still have a high water landscape. We see this happen a lot. People plant in the low water plants, but they don't understand their irrigation system. They don't understand their timer, and they don't end up saving water. They're watering way too much, and then the plant health suffers as well. So we have a whole series of classes about irrigation that I really encourage you to either sign up for or check afterwards. That's going to be one of your big keys to success. I will say that we are in the process of getting all of these workshops online right now. They should all be posted by the end of next week in terms of the registration information. So if you don't see them right now, check back in next weekend. And so what's next is Plan to Plant, the best time of the year. It's going to be mid-November or a bit later. Summer, spend it planning out things, doing some research, designing, killing your turf. Summer's the best time to kill turf if you need to take out turf. And early fall, doing other site work, getting your irrigation ready. And so with that, we are going to do our quick ending poll. It's really important to us. Webinars are something new that we're doing, these online workshops. So we really need your feedback to let us know how we're doing, if there's any way we can do this better, and if you have any other thoughts to share with us. We also just love general comments about how your experience with the workshop was, if you learned anything that's particularly useful or that you know that you are going to use. So if you have other comments for us, I would really love to take a look at them, and you can just put those into the chat. And with that, we are going to launch the poll, and then immediately following that, I will be available. I know it's already a couple minutes after 12. Thank you for staying with us. And I'll be here as long as we need to answer everybody's question. I guess for those of you who, after you finished with your poll, if you have any questions and want to type them into the question and answer, then we can start answering questions right away while some people are finishing their polls. Did have one question come in. Do I provide guided tours of my native garden? I've showed a bunch of pictures, and I often show a bunch of pictures of my home garden. I am not set up to do that. However, I do use it quite a bit as a teaching tool. So if you want to see more and learn more about that garden, I show it a lot and use the front yard as a detailed example in our California native garden design class, which we're going to be reteaching in the fall as we go into that series of design and then executing and installing the native garden. And then that class is also available on YouTube right now on our channel. That's the first one we did and posted it to YouTube. And then I also use other parts of that showing the installation process for the installation establishment of native garden classes. We do occasional guided tours, and when we do classes in person at the Waterwise Community Center, we often use our demonstration garden there as examples, and we will do garden tours of those.
And Scott, in the chat, we had another nursery, the Hahamanga Grow Native Nursery.
Oh, great.
Seiko.
Great. I was not sure if that was still around. I'm glad to hear that it is still going. I will make a note of that. Okay, so most people have gotten through, just a few more left. So we'll give question number 5. Oh, interesting. Okay. As this is going, then I'll just have up this last slide. Here are, actually, this is a slide that I always update with our new information. However, please note that these are all online workshops. These are not at the Waterwise Community Center. I forgot to shift that. And so we have do-it-yourself landscape design, landscape transformation basics. That's a class that we teach every month in the evening that includes turf removal, rebates that are available, just a basic introduction, all sorts of things you're supposed to be thinking about. We have our birds and butterflies habitat workshop coming up, one that's just about turf removal, one that's irrigation and watering basics that Brandon's going to be teaching, just that really basic demystifying the home irrigation system, both in terms of understanding your equipment and a little bit about watering. And then we're going to have some more specific irrigation classes. I teach one that's about efficient watering, both in terms of how to set up the system and then how to run it for fruit trees and vegetable gardens. We're going to be doing drip irrigation, design and installation. And then in September, we are going to do a whole series, kind of sequential series of workshops, starting with California native landscape design and going through a whole series of workshops, including design, including how to take, for a lot of people, if you have an existing lawn, your existing sprinkler system, use what you can of that underground network and convert that to an irrigation system that will support your new Waterwise garden. We're going to cover installation in another workshop and all sorts of stuff. So another question that we had come in is, the annual sale at Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden is usually about early October. Love their plants and supporting them, but it's earlier than recommended for planting. Any advice on planting earlier with their plants or later with another source? Good question. Yeah, there's kind of an arms race for fall planting every year, both in terms of where plant sales are happening, and even with bringing in, for most plant sales, even if a lot of stuff is propagated in-house, they're bringing things in from outside wholesalers as well that are specialty wholesalers. And if you wait too long, the most interesting plants are going to be gone. So I really consider prime planting time to be mid to late November. I'm thinking, getting plants in the ground a week before Thanksgiving kind of thing. It could still be warm during the day, but the days are getting shorter. So even if the peak temperature is high, it's for a lot less hours of the day. And so that's kind of the sweet spot where there's enough warmth to encourage some growth before things slow down for the true winter, but it's just not as harsh. Planting in October, mid-October, is still a lot better than planting in the summer. It's a little early for me sometimes, but it's definitely way better than planting in the summer or in the late spring. So a few options. You can just go ahead and do it. Or, I mean, one of the things, I go to Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Gardens sale as well. And I might just know that I'm going to have to be watering things, keeping them in partial shade for, 4 to 6 weeks before I'm going to get them in the ground. That's definitely an option. I'd say if you have a plan and you're going to take care of your plants, it's not going to be a problem to have them in the pot for a month or even 2 months in most cases. But I just try not to make that really like the default for me. And then in terms of another source after that, so the Grow Native Nursery at Rancho Santa Ana, they do continue to restock after their sale, and they're open all season. So you can go back later. So I would say if there's more common things, sometimes like a lot of the stuff we talked about in this workshop, pretty reliably, you're going to be able to get them later in the season. Now that's not a promise, but pretty reliably. So you might get your like rare or interesting or oddball plants at the plant sale and maybe wait for longer. Tree of Life Nursery in San Juan Capistrano, pretty reliably through most of the season, has a good plant selection. So they're a little bit of a drive, but can definitely be worth it. But even for if you're out near Waterwise Community Center, slightly over an hour. So if you're going to be getting a lot of plants for your garden, it can be worth it. And then Garrison Foothill Nursery is worth getting in touch with as well in Upland. Those would be some of my top choices. And then also with any of the local nurseries that carry natives, there's 3 or 4 wholesalers of native plants that are doing the propagation of the natives that then the local retail nurseries are going to have. Most of them all order from most of the same places. And so you can also inquire with them about special orders if it's something that they don't have in stock. Start looking for your plants maybe 4 weeks before you're actually going to want to be planting at least. And if people aren't going to have them in stock, see if they can special order them. They very well might be able to. Okay, well, then do we still have Brandon? Did you get the name of the person who had the question about nitrogen fixing?
Yes, she's still on, and I have her email
she's
as
still
well.
on. Okay, so so for those of you who want to, if you have any other questions, keep putting them in. For those of you who want to hear what will be a detailed question about how to potentially use or potentially not use native plants to improve the soil for fruit trees, feel free to hang on. And then also for those of you who are on to other things with your Saturday, thank you so much for joining us. Hope you join us again, and have a good rest of your weekend. So the topic of nitrogen fixers and native nitrogen fixers to improve the soil, especially for like productive crops and fruit trees. There are a few native nitrogen fixers. The most well-known of them is Ceanothus. Ceanothus can actually be a nitrogen fixer. And specifically, I have been told that Ceanothus, even though they're all the same genus, kind of fall into 2 general categories. I can't remember the technical term or if there even is a technical term of the categories, but if you look at Ceanothus plants and you look at a bunch of different species or varieties, it is very apparent that they kind of group into ones that are broader leafed and ones that have smaller, more narrow leaves. And this is information that was given to me by Bart O'Brien, who is an incredible California native horticulturist. He worked for, I think, decades at Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden and now runs the Bay Area, the Regional Parks Botanic Garden up there, which is an incredible native garden. And so he told me that they had a grad student that did some work looking into it, and that they found that the more narrow-leafed Ceanothus were the ones that were actually the ones that they would find fixing nitrogen in the soil. But when they did some research across Rancho, they found that it was a real grab bag. You can actually look at the nodules and the roots. The plants themselves don't literally fix the nitrogen. They actually have nodules in their roots that create habitat for a very specific bacteria that actually does that work. And that's how I believe all nitrogen fixing plants work. And so they found a real grab bag and not really a very reliable pattern that could be understood about why in some areas those species would be fixing nitrogen, and in some areas they weren't actively doing that. And I asked Bart about all this stuff because I partially come in horticulture from a permaculture background and was very interesting as I started working with California native plants about trying to work with native plants to improve soil and fertilize soil for the fruit trees. But one question that I had, and then I tried to do a literature review for, and I couldn't find any information about, as far as I could tell at the time, it just wasn't researched. Bart didn't know of anything, is nitrogen fixing plants are sometimes a little bit lazy. And this is not just California native plants. This is just known of nitrogen fixing plants, where if they are growing in soils that are nitrogen deficient compared to their growth needs, they will go through the process of having that symbiotic relationship with the bacteria to fix nitrogen and provide that. But if there's plenty of nitrogen availability already in the soil, they're not going to bother to spend the resources to go through that process. They're just going to use the soil available nitrogen. And so most of what we know about nitrogen fixing plants in like agricultural situations, in ecological agriculture, is based on annual nitrogen fixing plants, and it's based on systems and plants that want a higher nitrogen, higher soil fertility situation than our California native plants. Most of our California native plants grow in our local native soils, which are sometimes very high in lots of mineral nutrients, but tend to be very poor in nitrogen. So our native plants grow well in low nitrogen soils. That's why they don't need any nitrogen fertilizer to grow. They're just very adapted to using the very little nitrogen that's available to fuel their growth. So my question about using California native plants for nitrogen fixing in agricultural situations is that if those plants have already adapted to a way of life where they're adapted to very low nitrogen in a more fertile agricultural situation, would their sort of cutoff or threshold at where they would want to stop producing nitrogen be much lower than like our traditional agricultural nitrogen fixing plants, the ones like used as cover crops in agricultural situations? I couldn't find any information about that. The other thing I think about working with most California native plants for fixing nitrogen is the watering difference. You would obviously want to be growing these plants close enough to the root zone of our agricultural plants that that nitrogen would then become plant available. And like if you look at ceanothus, which can be quite sensitive to overwatering, you're just not going to want to grow it in the same irrigation zone as a fruit tree. It's just going to be way too much water. So after kind of looking at all of that, I just kind of came to the conclusion that I'm no longer going to really try to use California native plants for that nitrogen aspect of the ecological agricultural situation. I do love using native plants either in the same irrigation zone or separately, depending on the water requirements, as kind of the basis for an integrated pest management system, meaning planting native plants that flower all throughout the year of a variety of different species that will bring beneficial insects into the garden to help with my pest insects. So underneath my fruit tree areas, I have tons of yarrow. That is like one of the backbones of my approach to pest management, and it works very well, and everything's very happy growing together. Yarrow is also known as a nutrient accumulator, so every once in a while that yarrow is cut back. All of that biomass is just left as mulch in the orchard, and that builds organic matter, builds nutrients. So I think that's really where I focus on how to integrate native plants into kind of like a productive system. So hope that's helpful. And then in terms of how to actually add nitrogen in, personally, because our soils are low in nitrogen but good in other nutrients, I personally will often just use what I consider an appropriate amount of an organic fertilizer, which is a broad-in input. Locally, if you are near our service area, we are on hold because of COVID right now. We're rapidly trying to figure out how to get it back open, but we do have a free mulch and compost giveaway program. And our compost is actually relatively high in nitrogen. If you have questions about that, I can answer it. And so that compost that we give away, I use a lot of that in my home garden as well. And then also just the more traditional cover crops like inoculated beans and peas and things like that are definitely appropriate, as long as you make sure to cut them back before they actually set the seeds or kind of develop their beans or peas, because that's where all the nitrogen will go. And so I think that, unless there's follow-up questions, is all I have to say about that. I can see most people are clearing out. Oh, got a thank you on the question. So yeah, I will hang on till everyone else is gone if there's any other questions. And if not, hope to have you in another workshop soon.